I first heard the whispers my second week on the job. They weren't from the trees or the wind, like you'd expect in a place like Black Hollow Forest. No, these were human, desperate, ragged. They came in the dead of night when the radios crackled for no reason and my flashlight dimmed, no matter how many new batteries I fed it. The whispers always started the same way, a low murmur, like conversations overheard through thin walls. Then they'd grow clearer, more insistent, carrying fragments of words that made my skin crawl. Come back, they'd plead. Don't leave us here. Sometimes I'd catch what sounded like my own name, stretched and distorted until it became something unrecognizable. Locals had warned me, of course. Every small town has its campfire stories, and I chalked most of them up to boredom and bad moonshine. Don't go north past Miller's Ridge, the gas station clerk said while bagging my beef jerky, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he spoke. You go past there, you might not come back with your mind intact. His eyes had the hollow look of someone who'd seen too much, but I dismissed it as small-town dramatics. I laughed it off. It's easy to be brave when the sun is up, when the air is warm, and when you've got your boots on solid ground. It's easy to rationalize away the chill that runs down your spine when shadows move wrong, or when the forest goes silent in the middle of the day for no apparent reason. But one night, one cursed, black-soaked night, I got a call over the radio. A child had gone missing near the ridge. No other rangers were on shift. The dispatcher's voice cracked with static and something else, fear, maybe, or resignation. I didn't hesitate. I packed my gear, radioed back 10 to 4, and crossed into the one place every map refused to label properly. The cartographer's ink seemed to fade as if the paper itself rejected marking that cursed ground. What I found in the northern woods wasn't a child. It wasn't even something you could call human. I wish I had listened to the warnings. I wish I had never taken this job. And I wish, with everything I have left, that I could forget what I saw out there. But forgetting isn't an option when the memories aren't entirely your own, when they seep into your dreams like spilled ink and replay scenes you never lived. But the forest doesn't let you forget. It follows you. It waits. It watches. And sometimes it wants you back. I was hired as a ranger for Black Hollow in mid-September, just as the leaves were starting to crisp at the edges. The drive up had been beautiful, winding mountain roads flanked by maples and oaks beginning their slow burn into autumn colors. It was beautiful in the way remote places often are, peaceful, serene, untouched. But there was a tension beneath it all, like the ground itself held its breath. Even the air tasted different here, thick with something ancient and patient. The town of Black Hollow consisted of maybe 200 souls, if you were being generous. A single main street lined with buildings that hadn't seen fresh paint since the Carter administration. The locals watched me with a careful attention reserved for outsiders, their conversations dying abruptly when I entered the diner or the general store. Children would stop playing and stare until their mothers pulled them inside with sharp whispers I couldn't quite catch. From day one, the locals made it clear that there were unspoken rules. They never called them rules outright. That would have been too direct, too honest. Instead, they dropped them into casual conversation like breadcrumbs, hoping I'd be smart enough to follow the trail. Rule 1. Never go out after dark unless it's an emergency. Lot of dangerous animals up there, the mailman would say, though he could never name what kind when pressed. Rule 2. Never answer if someone calls your name from the woods. Sound travels funny in them hills, the librarian mentioned while checking out my books on local flora. Echoes back things that shouldn't echo. Rule 3. Don't ask about the northern woods. This one wasn't spoken at all. It was communicated through uncomfortable silences, abrupt subject changes, and the way people's eyes would dart away when I mentioned the uncharted sections of my patrol area. Naturally, I assumed this was all backwater superstition. I had worked parks before, Shenandoah, Big Bend, even up north in Denali, and each place had its lore. Ghost stories were as common as poison ivy in the ranger business. Mountain lions became monsters in the retelling, and every unexplained sound became evidence of the supernatural. I figured this was just the flavor of Black Hollow, seasoned with isolation and too many long winter nights. But even the other rangers were odd. There were only 3 of them on staff when I arrived. Ray, the oldest, had a permanent 1,000-yard stare and a limp he never explained. His left leg dragged slightly when he walked, and sometimes I'd catch him staring at it with a mixture of confusion and disgust, as if it belonged to someone else. He'd worked Black Hollow for 15 years, longer than anyone else, and had the kind of deep tan that spoke of countless hours under the sun. But his eyes were winter-pale, distant, always focused on something just over your shoulder. Sarah, who seemed nice enough at first, kept a tiny notebook where she wrote down the moon cycles like her life depended on it. She'd check it obsessively, sometimes multiple times in a single conversation, and I noticed she always scheduled her days off around the new moon. When I asked her about it once, she just said some nights were quieter than others and left it at that. Her handwriting was precise, almost mechanical, filling page after page with astronomical calculations and tidal charts that made no sense for a landlocked forest. And Tommy, the youngest, was always humming, nervously, as if trying to drown something out. It was never a recognizable tune, just a low, monotonous sound that seemed to vibrate in his chest. The humming would intensify whenever we passed certain areas of the forest, and I noticed he'd unconsciously cover his ears while doing it, as if protecting himself from sounds only he could hear. One night, while cleaning gear in the maintenance shed, I heard Ray muttering to himself outside. The shed's single window was grimy and cracked, but I could make out his silhouette in the pale moonlight. I peeked out and saw him standing perfectly still, facing the tree lean, his body rigid with tension. His lips were moving constantly, forming words I couldn't hear over the distance and the glass. I pressed my ear to the window and caught fragments. She's not gone. She never left. She never left. Over and over, like a prayer or a confession. His voice carried a desperate quality, the sound of someone trying to convince themselves of a lie they desperately wanted to believe. Then he turned and walked into the woods. No flashlight, no radio, no hesitation. His movements were strange, too fluid, too purposeful, as if something was guiding his steps. The darkness swallowed him within seconds, and the forest seemed to exhale as he disappeared, rustling leaves that shouldn't have moved in the still night air. I ran after him, yelling his name, my voice echoing strangely among the trees. The flashlight beam danced wildly as I stumbled through the undergrowth, catching glimpses of bark and shadow, but no sign of Ray. The forest felt different at night, alive in a way that daylight never revealed. Branches seemed to reach for me, roots caught at my feet, and somewhere in the distance, I could swear I heard laughter that wasn't quite human. But he was gone before I hit the tree line. Vanished as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. The next morning, he was back in his cabin like nothing happened. I found him making coffee, humming the same tune Tommy always hummed, acting as if walking into the woods at midnight was the most natural thing in the world. When I asked him about it, he just looked at me with those pale, winter eyes and said, "Some paths you walk once, some walk you forever." His words carried a weight that made my stomach clench, and I noticed his limp was more pronounced that day, as if his mysterious night walk had cost him something he couldn't afford to lose. That was the first real crack in my skepticism. The moment I began to understand that Black Hollow's rules weren't superstition, they were survival instructions written in the blood of those who'd learned them too late. The call came in at 11:42 p.m. on a Thursday night that felt cursed from the moment the sun went down. I was alone in the ranger station. Sarah had gone home sick with what she claimed was a migraine, though I'd seen her checking her moon notebook obsessively before she left. Tommy had the weekend off and was probably 3 counties away, visiting family. The building felt cavernous with just me in it, every small sound amplified by the empty rooms. The old wood creaked and settled around me like the bones of some sleeping giant. The radio's sudden crackle made me jump, spilling coffee across the incident report I'd been filing. The dispatcher's voice was shaky, breaking with static, and something else, barely controlled panic. Lost boy near Miller's Ridge. 8 years old. Name's Caleb. Went chasing after his dog around sundown. Mother says she saw him disappear past the sign. The dispatcher paused, and I could hear her breathing heavily into the microphone. Thompson, you copy? The sign. The one that read, crudely carved into a splintered board with letters that seemed to bleed rust. Turn back. Someone had driven nails through each letter, as if trying to pin the warning permanently into reality. I'd seen it dozens of times during my patrols, standing crooked at the junction where the main trail branched toward the northern woods. Local kids had clearly thrown rocks at it. The wood was pitted and scarred, but the message remained stubbornly legible. 10 to 4 dispatch. On my way, I radioed back, though something in my gut twisted with each word. The coffee I'd spilled was still warm, steaming in the cool night air that had somehow crept into the heated station. I strapped on my vest, the Kevlar feeling heavier than usual against my chest. Loaded a flare gun, standard procedure for night searches, though I never had to use one. Grabbed my radio, fresh batteries, and the emergency medical kit. My hands were steadier than they should have been, muscle memory taking over, while my mind raced through search protocols and worst-case scenarios. The ATV started on the third try, coughing to life like a reluctant beast. I started toward the ridge trail, headlights cutting through darkness that seemed thicker than usual, almost viscous. The engine's rumble felt reassuring at first, a mechanical heartbeat in the vast silence of the forest. But as I climbed higher, even that sound seemed to get swallowed by something hungry lurking between the trees. The night air was wrong. Too still. No crickets providing their usual symphony. No rustling of small animals in the underbrush. No owl calls echoing from the hollow spaces between hills. Just silence so thick it pressed against my eardrums like pressure underwater, making them pop and ring with phantom sounds. The forest looked different at night. Familiar landmarks became alien shapes, twisted by shadow into threatening forms. Trees I'd passed hundreds of times during day patrols loomed like sentinels, their branches reaching across the trail with what looked like deliberate malice. The ATV's headlights created a tunnel of white light that only made the surrounding darkness seem deeper, more impenetrable. Halfway up the ridge, the fog rolled in. It wasn't slow and creeping like morning mist. It poured in like a wall, thick and oily, with an almost organic quality that made my skin crawl. The vapor seemed to move against the wind, flowing uphill in defiance of natural law. My headlights barely cut through it, the beams diffusing into a useless glow that illuminated nothing but swirling gray phantoms. The ATV's engine began to sputter, then died completely. I tried the ignition, nothing. The battery indicator showed full charge, but the machine had simply given up, as if the fog itself was poison to mechanical things. I had to ditch the vehicle and continue on foot, compass in one hand, flashlight in the other, following a trail that seemed to shift beneath my feet. Caleb, I called, my voice sounding muffled and strange in the thick air. It's Ranger Thompson. Shout if you can hear me. The words seemed to die just feet from my mouth, absorbed by the fog before they could travel. But echoes came back anyway, my own voice, but distorted, stretched, coming from directions that made no sense. A moment later, something did shout back. But it wasn't a child's voice. It was a layered, like 3 or 4 voices speaking the same words, just slightly out of sync. Adult voices, but pitched high in a grotesque mimicry of childhood innocence. The sound made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. Help me. The words stretched impossibly long, each voice trailing off at a different time, creating a cascade of desperate pleas that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My flashlight flickered, dimmed, then brightened again, as if responding to some unseen electrical storm. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run. The sound had come from the left, deeper into the trees, off the marked trail where no lost child should have been able to go. But there in the mud softened by the fog, I saw them. Footprints. Bare feet, small, the right size for an 8-year-old boy. But they were too deep, pressed into the earth with more weight than a child should carry. and they were filled with something dark that wasn't quite mud, something that reflected my flashlight beam like liquid obsidian. I stepped off the trail. The moment my boots left the packed earth of the path, the world changed. The fog became a living thing, wrapping around me with what felt like conscious intent. The trees pressed closer, their branches forming a canopy so thick that my flashlight beam couldn't penetrate more than a few feet ahead. And the temperature dropped, not gradually, but all at once, as if I'd walked into a refrigerator. I followed the footprints. Each one led deeper into territory that didn't match any map I'd studied, through terrain that seemed to fold in on itself. Distance became meaningless. I'd walk for what felt like hours, then check my watch to find only minutes had passed. Other times, I'd take a few steps and lose entire hours to the fog and the twisted landscape. The footprints never wavered, never showed signs of a child stumbling or falling. They marched forward with mechanical precision, each one identical to the last, as if something wearing a child's feet was walking in perfectly measured steps. Eventually, I found a clearing with a massive, rotting oak in the center. The tree was ancient beyond measure, its trunk easily 20 feet across, its bark black with age and disease. But it was still alive. I could see sap weeping from cracks in its surface, though the liquid was too dark to be natural tree blood. At the base of the tree sat a boy. Caleb, presumably. Still, silent, eyes wide open, staring at nothing with an expression of perfect, terrible understanding. He was exactly as the dispatcher had described. 8 years old, brown hair, wearing a red jacket that was somehow spotless despite his journey through the muddy forest. But everything about him was wrong. He sat too straight, too still, with the artificial posture of a mannequin. His breathing was too regular, too measured, as if someone was manually operating his lungs. But when I touched his shoulder, his mouth opened, and he screamed, not like a child, but like something ancient and furious had been stuffed inside his tiny lungs. The sound was enormous, impossible, containing multitudes of voices all shrieking in harmony. It was the sound of every soul that had ever been lost in these woods, concentrated into one small throat and released all at once. I fell backward, my ears ringing, vision blurring with tears. I hadn't realized I was crying. And in that moment of disorientation, the tree opened its bark. Yes, open. The ancient would split like flesh, revealing a hollow interior that pulsed with its own sickly light. The cavity was too deep, too organic, lined with what looked like wet muscle tissue. And from that impossible depth came the sound of breathing, slow, patient, enormous. The boy was pulled inside, not dragged or grabbed, but drawn in as if by invisible strings, his body moving with the same mechanical precision as his footprints. His eyes never left mine, and his mouth continued to pour forth that impossible scream until the bark sealed shut behind him with a wet, final sound. The clearing fell silent. Even the fog seemed to hold its breath. And then, carved into the bark where the boy had disappeared, words began to appear, burned into the wood by some internal heat, glowing briefly before fading to black scars. Your turn, Aran. God help me. I ran like the coward I never thought I was. My legs moved without conscious thought, carrying me away from that cursed clearing with a speed born of pure animal terror. Branches whipped at my face, roots tried to trip me, and thorns tore at my jacket, but I didn't slow down. Behind me, I could hear the oak tree groaning, its wood creaking and splitting as if something massive was stirring within its hollow core. The fog seemed to thicken with each step, becoming almost solid, like running through wet cotton. My flashlight beam grew dimmer and dimmer until it was barely a candle's worth of illumination in the vast darkness. But I kept running, gasping for air that tasted of decay and ancient secrets, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. But no matter which direction I turned, the forest bent around me. Trees I passed once came again. The same lightning-scarred pine, with its distinctive split trunk. The same boulder shaped like a sleeping bear. The same fallen log that formed a natural bridge over a stream that gurgled with water too dark to reflect my light. Landmarks looped in impossible ways, as if the forest had become a Mobius strip where every path led back to itself. I'd run for what felt like miles, only to find myself back at the oak clearing, where the tree now pulsed with steady rhythm like a gigantic heart. Each time I arrived back there, new words would be burning themselves into the bark: lost, alone, forgotten, mine. I was trapped in a spiraling path that grew smaller with each iteration, like water circling a drain. The air grew heavier with every step, thick with moisture and something else: the metallic taste of fear, the copper tang of spilled blood, the sweet rot of things that should have been buried long ago. That's when I started hearing the whispers again, closer now. Not from the trees, but from inside my head, speaking in voices I almost recognized. My mother's voice, warning me about staying out too late. My father's voice, disappointed that I'd chosen such a dangerous profession. My ex-wife's voice, listing all the reasons she'd left me. But underneath those familiar sounds were others, stranger and more disturbing. Children's voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking in perfect unison. He's watching. He remembers. You stepped off the path. Now the path steps into you. We try to run too. We tried to leave too, but the forest keeps what it catches. I clapped my hands over my ears, but the voices only grew louder, as if blocking my physical hearing had opened some other channel of perception. The words seemed to vibrate through my bones, resonate in my skull, echo in spaces inside me I didn't know existed. Through my terror, I noticed something that shouldn't have been there: a trail of stacked stones, cairns about 3 feet high, placed every few meters along what might have been a path. They were clearly artificial, carefully balanced constructions that stood out starkly against the chaotic tangle of the forest. Something in me screamed not to follow them. Every survival instinct I possessed, every hard-learned lesson from years of wilderness work, told me that these markers were not meant to guide lost travelers to safety. They radiated wrongness, standing like silent sentinels in the fog, watching my approach with the patience of things that had waited centuries for the right victim. But I did follow them anyway, because the alternative was to remain lost in that spiraling nightmare forever, running in endless circles while the voices in my head grew louder and more numerous with each repetition. Each cairn I passed seemed wrong in its own particular way. The first was built from stones that were too perfectly round, too smooth, as if they'd been polished by countless hands over countless years. Some were warm to the touch despite the cold night air, radiating heat like they contained their own internal fires. Others hummed like they were vibrating at frequencies just below the threshold of hearing, making my teeth ache and my vision blur. The third cairn was built from stones that weren't stones at all, but what looked like fossilized bones, femurs and skulls and rib cages compressed into mineral hardness over geological time. The fourth bled when I touched it, thin trickles of red that were warm and fresh despite coming from cold rock. By the time I reached the seventh cairn, I understood that I was walking through some kind of countdown, moving toward a destination that had been prepared specifically for me. Each marker was a milepost on a journey I'd begun the moment I'd stepped off the marked trail, a journey that had been inevitable from the first night I'd heard whispers in the forest. Then I reached the last one. There, carved into the topmost stone with letters that seemed to writhe in my flashlight beam, was my name, Thompson. Not Ranger Thompson or J. Thompson or even my first name. Just my surname, carved in letters that looked like they'd been burned into the stone with acid or cloths. The carving was fresh. I could see stone dust still clinging to the grooves, though I hadn't told anyone my last name. Not in town. Not even the dispatcher, who'd only called me by my radio number. Behind that cairn was a drop-off into what looked like a ravine. The edge fell away into darkness, so complete that my flashlight couldn't find the bottom. But I could hear water down there, thick black water that moved with the slow viscosity of oil, lapping against unseen shores with sounds like whispered secrets. And from that water rose faces. At first, I thought they were reflections, my own face, distorted by the moving surface. But as I stared, more appeared. Dozens of them, then hundreds, floating just beneath the surface like lily pads made of human features. Some were human, men and women of all ages, their expressions frozen in moments of terminal understanding. I recognized some of them from missing person posters I'd seen in town, hikers and hunters who'd vanished over the years, the disappearances explained away as animal attacks or simple misadventure. Some were animal faces, deer with two intelligent eyes, bears with expressions of human sorrow, dogs that might once have belonged to families in town. All of them stared up at me with the same terrible awareness, the same desperate plea for help that could never come. And some were things I don't have words for. Faces that combined human and animal features in ways that violated every natural law. Eyes where mouths should be. Mouths that opened to reveal more faces nested inside like Russian dolls. Features that shifted and flowed like living liquid, never quite settling into any recognizable configuration. All of them reached toward me with desperate, grasping motions, their movements creating ripples that spread across the dark water in perfect concentric circles. And from each face came a whisper, barely audible, but impossible to ignore. Join us. Stay with us. Become us. I turned to run, but someone blocked my path. It was Tommy. But his eyes were all wrong. Solid black from lid to lid, with no iris or pupil visible, like holes punched through his skull to reveal an empty void beyond. His skin had the waxy pallor of a corpse, gray-white and somehow translucent, showing the dark network of veins beneath. His lips were stitched shut with fishing line, the kind of heavy-duty monofilament used for deep-sea angling. The stitches were crude but effective, binding his mouth closed with surgical precision. Blood had dried around each puncture wound, creating a macabre smile of rust-red stains. And still, impossibly, he smiled. The stitches pulled tight as his cheeks lifted, and I could see the fishing line cutting deeper into his flesh with each expression of grotesque happiness. He held out his hand toward me, and I could see that his fingernails had been replaced with the same material as the cairns, smooth stones that clicked together when he flexed his fingers. His palm was carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, sigils that seemed to twist and change when I wasn't focusing on them. I didn't take his hand. Instead, I bolted through the trees, smashing into branches, scraping my legs on thorns and rocks, lungs burning with each desperate breath. Behind me, I could hear Tommy's stitched laughter, somehow audible despite his sealed mouth, a sound like wind through a broken flute. The forest seemed to actively fight my escape, branches grabbing at my jacket, roots rising from the ground to trip me, the very air growing thicker with each step. But terror gave me strength I didn't know I possessed, and I crashed through the underbrush like a wounded animal fleeing predators. Eventually, after what felt like hours but could have been minutes, I broke through. I hit the gravel trail with such force that I fell and rolled, skinning my knees and palms on the rough stones. But it was the most beautiful pain I'd ever felt, because it meant I was back on marked territory, back in the world of maps and regulations and things that made sense. The ATV was exactly where I'd left it, and this time it started on the first try, engine purring with mechanical reliability. When I looked back toward the forest, the fog had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. So had the cairns. So had any trace of the path I'd followed into hell. But carved into the nearest tree, in letters that glowed faintly in my headlights, were two words that made my blood freeze. Soon, Thompson. Back at the station, I collapsed onto the floor, shaking so violently that I couldn't hold a cup of coffee without spilling it everywhere. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with their familiar electric hum, and the radiator clanked with the comforting sounds of civilization. But nothing felt real anymore. The solid wood floor beneath me, the regulation gray walls, the neat stacks of incident reports, all of it seemed like a stage set, a careful illusion designed to make me forget what I'd experienced in the northern woods. I sat there until dawn, watching the windows slowly lighten with the approaching sun, afraid to close my eyes because every time I did, I saw Tommy's stitched smile and heard the whispers from the dark water. When the coffee finally stopped tasting like metal and fear, I forced myself to write up an incident report, though my hand shook so badly that the words were barely legible. The next morning, I tried to report it. I called the dispatcher, filed official paperwork, even drove into town to speak with the sheriff directly. But there was no record of any call. No missing child report. No family named Henderson with a boy named Caleb. The dispatcher I'd spoken to the night before didn't exist. According to the duty roster, no one had been on dispatch during the hours in question. The sheriff, a heavyset man named Morrison who'd clearly been in law enforcement since before I was born, listened to my story with a patient expression of someone humoring a drunk or a crazy person. When I finished, he leaned back in his creaking chair and studied me with tired eyes. "Son," he said finally, "you're new here, so you don't know how things work yet. But let me give you some advice. What happens in the northern woods stays in the northern woods. You try to bring it back with you. Try to make it real in the daylight world, and it'll follow you home. You understand what I'm telling you?" I didn't, but something in his tone suggested that understanding would come whether I wanted it to or not. That afternoon, Ray found me in the supply shed, staring blankly at the wall while pretending to inventory emergency equipment. He sat me down on a stack of sleeping bags and poured me a glass of something strong from a hip flask that smelled like it could strip paint. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked quietly. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He pulled out an old ranger map from a folder he'd been carrying, one that had been locked away in a drawer marked Historical Documents, Do Not Remove. The paper was yellowed with age, and the ink had faded to brown, but the details were still clearly visible. This map was different from the standard Forest Service charts I'd been using. It showed the same basic geography, the ridge lines, the river system, the marked trails, but there were additional features that appeared on no modern survey. Structures that shouldn't exist. Boundaries that made no geographical sense. And in the northern woods, instead of the usual blank space marked unmapped territory, there was a detailed illustration of something that looked like a vast spiral, with notes written in cramped handwriting around the margins. "This," Ray said, pointing to the northern woods with a finger that trembled slightly, "isn't land. It's memory." The town was built over something it tried to forget, but forgetting and gone ain't the same thing. I leaned closer to study the map. The notes around the spiral were in different handwritings, different inks, as if multiple people had added to it over the years. Some were in languages I didn't recognize. Others were in English, but the words made no sense. Threshold active during new moon. Cairns marked the counting paths. The tree remembers all who feed it. What is it? I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. Ray sighed, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. Some call it a spirit. Others call it a place between worlds. The old-timers who first settled here, they called it the Hungry Dark. We just call it the Hollow. It shows you what you fear, what you lost, what you never had. But mostly, it shows you what you could become if you let it. He flipped the map over, revealing more notes on the back, along with what looked like a family tree that had been crossed out and rewritten dozens of times. Names were connected by lines that formed no logical pattern, and many had been struck through with thick black ink. "Every ranger who's worked here longer than a year ends up on this map," Ray continued. "Some of us make it back from our first trip into the woods. Some don't. And some." He pointed to his own name, which appeared 3 times in different handwritings, connected to itself by a line that formed a loop. "Some of us come back, but we bring pieces of it with us." I realized then that there may have never been a boy named Caleb. Or maybe there had been, but not last night, not during my shift. Maybe I'd seen someone else's memory, someone else's encounter with a thing that lived in the northern woods. Maybe every ranger experienced their own version of the missing child, their own personal nightmare designed to draw them deeper into the forest's web. "How long?" I asked. "How long have you been different?" Ray looked down at his hands, studying them as if they belonged to someone else. "Hard to say. Time works different when you've been touched by the Hollow. Could be 5 years, could be 50. Could be I never came back at all. And this is just the echo of someone who used to be named Ray." That evening, back in my cabin, I found a single child's shoe outside my door. It was small, muddy, with Velcro straps instead of laces, the kind an 8-year-old boy might wear. But when I picked it up, it was warm, as if it had just been removed from a living foot. And next to it, pressed deep into the soft earth around my porch, were muddy footprints leading inside. The front door was still locked. The windows were latched from the inside, but the footprints went right through the wall, as if the child who'd made them existed in a space that overlapped with but wasn't bound by physical reality. I followed the prints through my cabin, growing colder with each step. They led to my bedroom, around my bed, and stopped directly in front of my dresser mirror. In the reflection, standing behind my own image, was a boy with wide, terrified eyes and a mouth that moved constantly, forming words I couldn't hear. When I turned around, nothing was there. But when I looked back at the mirror, he was closer, his small hand pressed against the glass from the other side. And carved into the surface of the mirror, letters appeared one by one as I watched. "Help me, Thompson." The next morning, I packed everything I owned into my truck: clothes, books, camping gear, even the coffee maker I'd bought specifically for this job. I wrote a resignation letter that I never intended to deliver, left it on the kitchen table, and drove out of Black Hollow before the sun was fully up. The road stretched ahead of me, winding down through the mountains toward civilization and sanity. I had enough savings to last a few months while I looked for another position, maybe something in a nice, safe national park where the only dangers were bears and tourists. Somewhere the trees didn't whisper, and the missing stayed missing instead of showing up in mirrors. But the road kept turning back toward Black Hollow. I'd check my GPS, confirm I was heading south toward the interstate, but somehow the landmarks kept repeating. The same abandoned gas station with its rusted pumps. The same roadside produce stand that had been closed for years. The same weathered billboard advertising a casino that had burned down in the 80s. No matter what GPS I used, my phone, the truck's built-in navigation, even an old paper atlas I kept in the glove compartment, I ended up back at the ranger station before dawn. The first time, I thought I'd made a wrong turn. The second time, I blamed fatigue and confusion. By the fourth attempt, as I watched the familiar wooden sign for Black Hollow Forest appear in my headlights like a cruel joke, I understood that leaving wasn't a choice I was allowed to make. The truck's odometer showed I'd driven over 300 miles during that endless night, but I'd never gotten more than 50 miles from the forest boundary. The fuel gauge hadn't moved. The radio picked up the same country station no matter how far I drove, playing the same 3 songs in endless rotation. And in the passenger seat, appearing and disappearing like a heat mirage, was the shadow of a small boy who pointed constantly toward the woods. Ray found me sitting in my truck outside the station that morning, engine still running, staring at the fuel gauge that somehow read full despite the miles I'd supposedly driven. "Could have told you that wouldn't work," he said, settling his hip against my driver's side door. "Road only goes one way once you've been marked." Ray called it the tether, the invisible chain that bound certain people to the forest, ensuring they could never truly leave. "You went too deep," he explained. "Saw too much. You can leave the forest, but it don't leave you. It's in your blood now, in your dreams, in the spaces between your thoughts. Every road you take will lead back here eventually." He was right, of course. Even when I tried to sleep in my truck at a rest stop 2 states away, I'd wake up in my cabin with no memory of how I'd gotten there. Even when I took a bus to the airport and bought a ticket to California, I'd find myself walking up the trail to the ranger station as if I'd never left. The tether wasn't just geographical. It was existential, woven into the fabric of who I was becoming. The final straw came 3 nights later, after I'd given up trying to escape and resigned myself to finishing out my contracted season. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar night sounds of the forest: owls hooting, branches creaking, the distant sound of water flowing over rocks. Normal sounds that should have been comforting but now carried undertones of menace, as if the forest was speaking in code about things I didn't want to understand. Around midnight, I heard scratching at my cabin door. At first, I thought it might be a raccoon or a bear investigating the scent of food. But the scratching was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It formed patterns, 3 short scratches, 3 long ones, 3 short again. SOS in Morse code, repeated over and over with mechanical precision. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, ready to shoo away whatever animal was causing the disturbance. When I opened it, there was no one there. But carved into the wood of my door, the letters still warm from whatever had made them, were 2 words, "Help me." The carving was fresh, wood shavings still clinging to the grooves, but there was no sign of whatever had made them. No footprints in the soft earth around my porch. No tool marks that might indicate how the letters had been formed. Just those 2 words, burned into my door like a brand, pulsing with their own faint luminescence in the darkness. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my truck with the engine running and the doors locked, but the words were still there when the sun came up. Worse, they seemed to have grown deeper overnight, as if the door itself was trying to heal around them, but couldn't quite manage it. The next day, I radioed in an emergency. Said I was going into the northern woods one last time, that I had unfinished business to settle. Ray's voice crackled back over the radio, heavy with resignation and something that might have been pity. Then say goodbye to who you were, Thompson. Because whoever comes back ain't going to be the same person who went in. Sarah and Tommy were both off duty, Sarah with her mysterious migraines that always coincided with certain moon phases, Tommy visiting family who might or might not exist. I was alone when I gathered my gear for what I knew would be my final patrol. I took only the essentials, a flare gun with 6 shells, my father's hunting knife that had never failed me, and the historical map Ray had shown me, with its cryptic notes and impossible geography. Everything else, radio, GPS, first aid kit, I left behind. Where I was going, none of those things would matter. The walk to Miller's Ridge felt different this time. The forest wasn't trying to hide from me anymore, wasn't pretending to be a normal woodland ecosystem. The trees leaned inward over the trail, creating a tunnel of branches that blocked out most of the sky. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind through the leaves. Even my own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. When I reached the clearing again, the tree had moved. It was no longer standing alone in an empty space, but was now in the center of a grove of standing stones, megalithic structures that hadn't been there during my first visit. The stones were arranged in a perfect circle around the oak, each one carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. They were ancient beyond measure, worn smooth by centuries of weather, but the carvings remained sharp and clear as if they'd been made yesterday. The oak itself had changed as well. It was larger now, its trunk easily 30 feet across, its branches reaching impossibly high into a sky that seemed darker than the surrounding forest. The bark pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm like a gigantic heartbeat, and sap continued to weep from its cracks. But now the liquid was clearly red, clearly blood, flowing in streams down to pool around the roots. And behind the tree, impossible but undeniably real, stood a door. An actual wooden door, freestanding in the middle of the clearing, wrapped in vines and moss, but somehow still functional. It was old, older than the town, older than the first European settlements in the area. But the wood was solid, the brass handle polished to a mirror shine. There was no frame, no wall to support it, just a door standing in empty space like a portal between worlds. Around the base of the door, arranged in careful patterns, were items that had no business being in a forest clearing. A child's tricycle, red paint faded but still recognizable. A wedding dress, yellow with age but laid out as if waiting for a bride. A military uniform from what looked like World War II, complete with medals and ribbons. Dozens of personal belongings, each one representing a life that had intersected with this place and never left. I approached the door slowly, my father's knife heavy in my hand, though I knew it would be useless against whatever waited beyond the threshold. The brass handle was warm to the touch, and when I turned it, I heard the soft click of a lock disengaging. I opened it. Inside was my childhood bedroom, exactly as it had been when I was 8 years old. The same blue wallpaper, with its pattern of sailing ships. The same wooden bed with its hand-carved headboard. The same desk where I'd done homework and built model airplanes and dreamed of growing up to be a forest ranger. And sitting on the bed, small and vulnerable in flannel pajamas, was me, younger, afraid, crying with the helpless desperation of a child who understood that something terrible was about to happen but was powerless to prevent it. The boy looked up at me with eyes full of recognition and terror. His mouth moved, forming words I could barely hear. "Don't let it take me. Please don't let it take me." I stepped inside, my boots sinking into the familiar carpet with its pattern of cowboys and horses. The room smelled exactly right, that mixture of crayon wax and fabric softener, and the faint mustiness of old wood that had defined my childhood. On the desk were the model planes I'd built, still in their various stages of completion. On the bookshelf were the adventure novels I devoured, their spines worn from countless readings. But underneath the familiar smells was something else, the metallic scent of fear, the sweet rot of decay, the ozone smell that preceded thunderstorms. The room was perfect in every detail, but it was wrong in ways I couldn't articulate, like a photograph that had been developed in chemicals that changed the colors just slightly. Behind me, the door slammed shut with a sound like thunder. I spun around, grabbing for the handle, but it was gone. The door had become part of the wall, seamless and solid, trapping me in a nightmare version of my own past. The boy on the bed continued to cry, but now his tears were black, streaming down his cheeks like ink. When he opened his mouth to speak again, his voice was the layered, multi-toned whisper I'd heard in the forest. "You came back. You always come back. Everyone always comes back." The room began to change around me. The wallpaper darkened, the ships on it becoming ghost vessels sailing across black seas. The model planes on the desk crumbled to dust. The books on the shelf opened themselves, their pages fluttering as if blown by wind that didn't exist, revealing text that writhed and changed as I watched. And in the mirror above my childhood dresser, I saw not my own reflection but the faces from the dark water, all the lost souls who had found their way to this place and never left. They pressed against the glass from the other side, their mouths moving in silent screams, their eyes pleading for a rescue that would never come. The boy on the bed stood up, and I saw that his feet never quite touched the floor. He floated toward me with arms outstretched, and when he spoke again, his voice was my own. "Welcome home, Thompson. We've been waiting for you, but I don't patrol anymore. The uniform hangs in my closet, pressed and ready, but I haven't worn it and time is difficult to measure here. Sometimes I think it's been days. Sometimes it feels like years. I watch now. I listen. I wait. My cabin sits at the edge of the clearing where the oak tree grows, though the cabin wasn't there before. Or maybe it was always there, and I just couldn't see it until I became part of the forest design. The walls are lined with maps, dozens of them, hundreds, showing Black Hollow Forest in different eras, different realities. Some show the landscape as it was before human settlement. Others show it as it might become, when the last pretense of civilization finally falls away and the hollow reclaims what was always its own. Sometimes hikers go missing. Sometimes they return different. Their families notice the changes first, how they speak in whispers, how they flinch at sudden sounds, how they stare at mirrors with expressions of trapped horror. The lucky ones adapt, learn to live with the pieces of the forest they carry inside them. The unlucky ones find their way back to the northern woods, drawn by dreams they can't escape and voices they can't ignore. I see them sometimes walking past my cabin in the early morning hours, people who look familiar but aren't quite right, their faces slightly blurred as if I'm seeing them through water. Ray is among them, and Sarah, and Tommy with his stitched smile. We nod to each other in recognition, members of an exclusive club that no one wants to join. The northern woods are still off limits to visitors. But now I know why, and I know the warnings aren't enough. They never were. I wasn't meant to save that child named Caleb, because Caleb was never real. He was bait, a lure designed specifically for me. I was meant to replace something else, something that had been part of the forest ecosystem for longer than human memory. A guardian, a watcher, a guide for those who would inevitably be drawn into the hollow's embrace. And some nights, when the moon is dark and the fog rolls in thick from the hollows, I hear my own voice calling out from the woods, begging someone not to follow the cairns, not to trust the whispers, not to step off the marked trails. But they always do. Eventually, the forest has patience beyond human understanding. It knows that everyone who enters its domain carries their own darkness, their own weakness that can be exploited. Don't come looking for me. You won't find who I used to be, but something will find you. And when it does, you'll understand why the maps refuse to label the northern woods properly, why the locals speak in whispers about things that shouldn't exist, and why some warnings are written in blood and carved into living wood. The forest remembers everything. And once it knows your name, it never lets you go. There's a saying among rangers, fire towers don't burn. They haunt. I didn't understand it the first time I heard it. I thought it was just poetic nonsense. Something grizzled old rangers said after too many whiskeys and too many years on patrol, their minds frayed by isolation and endless miles of wilderness. But now I know what they meant. Now I understand why their voices dropped to whispers when they spoke of certain towers, why their eyes would dart toward the tree lean as if something might be listening. They weren't being dramatic. They were being careful. When the higher-ups assigned me to Tower Number 9, they didn't tell me about the history. They just said it was remote but essential, that it hadn't been manned in over 20 years, but due to some increased wildfire risks and new satellite data showing potential fire corridors, they needed someone stationed there for the summer. The paperwork was rushed, the briefing minimal. I should have questioned why they seemed so eager to get me up there, why Marshal Grant avoided eye contact when he handed me the keys. I wasn't new to solo firewatch. I'd done seasons before, months at a time alone in a wooden box above the tree lean, watching for the first wisps of smoke that could turn into infernos. I liked the solitude, the space to think, to breathe. The way dawn broke over miles of uninterrupted forest, painting everything gold and green. It was honest work, important work, and it suited me. But Tower Number 9 was different from the moment I saw it. The first night, I woke to the sound of footsteps inside the tower. Not on the stairs leading up, inside, circling the small room where I slept. Measured steps, deliberate, as if someone was pacing. When I reached for my flashlight, the footsteps stopped. When I turned it off, they resumed. The second night, I heard breathing just outside the glass windows, 60 feet up. Slow, ragged exhalations that fogged the glass from the outside. I pressed my face to the window, straining to see what could possibly be out there at that height. Nothing but darkness and the sound of lungs that seemed too large, too damaged, working to pull in air. The third night, the radios began to speak on their own. Static at first, then fragments of voices, conversations from years past bleeding through the airwaves. Weather reports from 1982. Missing hiker alerts from 1995. And underneath it all, a woman's voice, calling for help that would never come. By the end of the first week, I knew I wasn't alone up there. But it wasn't hikers or pranksters looking to scare the new guy. It wasn't a bear that had learned to climb or a stalker with some elaborate setup. The sounds came from inside the walls. The breathing came from something that could hover outside 6-story windows. The voices on the radio knew things about me I'd never told anyone. It was something older, something that had been waiting. And it remembered me. No, I take that back. It remembered someone who looked just like me. Someone who had stood in this same spot, breathed this same thin mountain air, felt the same creeping dread as the sun set behind the peaks. The resemblance wasn't coincidental. Nothing about my assignment had been coincidental. And it wanted to finish what it started 25 years ago. If you ever see a red light blinking from the top of a fire tower that shouldn't have power, don't go up there. Don't be curious about why it's lit when the maps show it is decommissioned. Don't climb the ladder, no matter how sturdy it looks. Don't look through the logs, even if your job depends on it. Don't listen to the voice on the radio that says your name with perfect pronunciation, as if it's been practicing. And for the love of God, don't open the trapdoor at the top. That's how they get out. That's how they've always gotten out. I took the assignment out of desperation, the kind that makes you ignore red flags and accept offers that seem too good to be true. My last post had ended poorly, budget cuts that left us understaffed, closed trails that meant half our territory went unmonitored, and a small avalanche that took out half the northern sector's communication equipment. The incident report blamed poor maintenance and bad weather, but I knew better. We've been spread too thin, asked to do too much with too little. When the funding dried up, they needed someone to blame, and seasonal rangers are always the easiest targets. I needed the work, needed it badly. The bills don't stop coming just because the government decides wilderness protection isn't a priority this fiscal year. And the fire season was heating up fast. Drought conditions, high winds, and a tinderbox of dead vegetation from a beetle infestation 2 summers prior. Every ranger in the state was pulling double shifts, and experienced fire watch operators were in high demand. So when they offered me Tower Number 9, I didn't ask too many questions. The pay was better than anything else available, and they promised it would lead to a permanent position. I should have wondered why no one else had taken it, why it was still open this late in the season when every other post had been filled months ago. Just keep eyes on the tree line, my supervisor, Marshall Grant, told me. His office smelled like coffee and old cigarettes, maps covering every wall, marked with red pins showing active fire zones. It's quiet out there. You'll have time to read, maybe work on that novel you mentioned. He handed me a thick logbook, the leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. I noticed a name scribbled in faded pencil on the first page, written in the careful block letters they teach in ranger training. W. Danner. 1997. That was the last ranger stationed there. The handwriting was neat at first, professional, but as I flipped through the pages, it became increasingly erratic. Cramped, desperate. Danner ever come back? I asked, thumbing the edge of the yellowed paper. Some pages were water-damaged. Others looked deliberately torn. Marshall looked at me strangely, his weathered face creasing into an expression I couldn't read. He was old school, 25 years in the service, and I'd never seen him look uncertain about anything. Not exactly. Tower caught fire. He wasn't found. The words hung in the air like smoke. I raised an eyebrow. And the tower's still standing. Marshall's jaw tensed, and he busied himself shuffling papers on his desk, avoiding my eyes. You'll see. Just keep the damn logs updated. Report anything unusual. Anything at all. The emphasis on the last part should have been another warning, but I was too focused on the job to pay attention. The hike up was brutal, worse than anything I'd experienced in 5 years of backcountry work. The trail to Tower Number 9 wasn't maintained. Overgrown roots grabbed at my boots, broken planks on footbridges sagged under my weight, and a long switchback section felt like a climb into nowhere. My GPS lost signal 3 miles in, and the trail markers were old, some so faded I could barely make out the numbers. The forest itself felt wrong. Too quiet. Even the birds seemed to avoid this area, and I realized I hadn't heard a single sound of wildlife since I'd passed the last official trail marker. The trees grew differently here too, twisted in ways that suggested they'd survived fires that had never been reported. The tower stood like a skeletal finger pointing toward the sky, its metal framework dark against the late afternoon sun. It was taller than I expected, even after seeing it on the elevation charts. Easily 60 feet, maybe more. The metal frame was weathered but solid, the wooden observation deck at the top somehow pristine despite its age. A wraparound platform ringed by railing that showed patches of rust, but no structural damage. Below, the forest stretched endlessly in all directions, an ocean of green that could hide anything. I climbed the ladder slowly, my pack heavy with a week's worth of supplies. The rungs were solid under my hands, recently maintained despite what Marshall had implied about the tower being abandoned. Someone had been taking care of this place, but who? Inside the observation deck, it smelled like time and smoke, with undertones of something else I couldn't identify. The air was thick with a musk I couldn't place, burnt paper mixed with something organic and sour, like meat left too long in the sun. The windows were clean, which seemed impossible after 20 years of abandonment. The floor was swept. Someone had been here recently, but there were no fresh tracks on the trail, no sign of how they'd gotten here. The old radio was mounted on the wall, its analog dials and switches looking like something from the 1970s. The power cord was unplugged, coiled neatly beside it. Dead wires hung from the back, clearly cut, not worn through by age. But when I touched it, just brushed my fingers against the metal housing, the dial spun on its own, slowly, deliberately, stopping at a frequency that showed nothing but static. I laughed, the sound echoing strangely in the small space. Static electricity, maybe. The tower creaked around me like it was breathing, metal expanding and contracting in ways that seemed too rhythmic to be natural. I turned on my flashlight and found the trapdoor I knew would be there. Every fire tower has storage space below the main observation level. The wooden hatch was newer than the rest of the structure, the hinges recently oiled. When I lifted it, my light revealed a crawl space that extended under the entire floor, larger than it should have been, disappearing into shadows that seemed to swallow my flashlight beam. What I found down there chilled me more than the mountain air. A handprint on the inside of the hatch, pressed into the wood as if the person had been trapped below, clawing at the underside of the door. But it wasn't dusty or faded like everything else in the tower. The print was fresh, the wood still slightly damp where the palm had pressed. The fingers were long, too long, and spread wider than any human hand should be able to stretch, like someone had pressed their palm there that morning, moments before I arrived. I climbed back up and locked the hatch behind me, checking the bolt twice. But as I settled in for my first night, I could swear I heard something moving in the space below, testing the strength of the lock. Day 3 brought the fog, rolling in from the valley like a living thing. From the tower, I had full visibility of the surrounding area on clear days. I could see the river winding through the valley miles out, trace the hiking trails that snake through the forest, spot the distant peaks that marked the edge of my watch zone. But that morning, everything was white, a blanket of mist that erased the world below and left me floating in a sea of clouds. The silence was absolute. Even the wind had died, leaving me suspended in cotton-thick air that seemed to muffle every sound. I'd experienced fog before, but nothing like this. It wasn't natural weather. It moved wrong, swirled in patterns that defied the terrain, and had arrived without any of the atmospheric conditions that usually preceded heavy morning mist. And then came the knocking. Soft at first, barely audible over the settling of the tower's wooden frame, but insistent, rhythmic, coming from directly underneath my feet. 3 knocks, then silence. 3 more knocks. Silence. I sat frozen on my cot, staring at the trapdoor I'd locked securely the night before. The steel bolt was still in place, but the knocking continued, patient and methodical. No animals could reach that height, and besides, the sound was too deliberate, too human. Someone or something was in the crawl space below, and they knew I was listening. I grabbed the flare gun from my emergency kit, aimed it at the trapdoor, and waited. My hands were shaking, whether from cold or fear I couldn't tell. The knocking stopped, as if whatever was down there sensed my readiness. But in the silence that followed, I heard something worse, the sound of breathing slow and labored, coming through the floorboards. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time seemed elastic in the fog, unmeasured and strange. Eventually, I lowered the flare gun, but I kept it within reach. By evening, the fog hadn't lifted, which was unusual. Mountain mist typically burned off by noon, especially during the dry season. But this fog seemed to thicken as the day wore on, pressing against the windows like curious fingers, leaving streaks that looked almost like letters in some unknown language. That's when I saw her. A woman, standing at the edge of the clearing where the forest began, just visible through the swirling white. She wore a ranger's uniform, but it was the old style, the kind they'd stopped using in the early 90s. The fabric looked crisp, unwrinkled, as if she just put it on. Her shoulder patch was different too, featuring a design I didn't recognize. One hand was raised in a slow, deliberate wave, fingers moving with mechanical precision. "Hello," I shouted down, my voice swallowed by the fog almost immediately. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge my call. Just kept waving, the gesture becoming hypnotic in its consistency. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Still no answer. No change in posture. The waving continued. I grabbed my binoculars from the equipment rack, hands fumbling with the focus dial. When I looked through them, adjusting for the distance and the fog, my heart dropped into my stomach like a stone. Her face. It was melted. Not burned in the way you'd expect from a fire. This was different. Her features had run like wax, flowing downward and reforming in impossible ways. Where her mouth should have been was a smooth expanse of flesh. Her eyes were holes, dark and empty, but somehow I could feel them watching me. And she was still waving, that terrible, patient gesture. I blinked hard, certain I was hallucinating. Altitude sickness, maybe, or exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. When I looked again, she was gone. No movement. No rustling of branches. Nothing to indicate where she'd gone or how she disappeared so completely. The fog swirled undisturbed where she'd been standing, as if she'd never existed at all. I tried to radio base, turning the dials on every frequency I knew. Static. White noise. The fog seemed to be interfering with the signal, though I'd never heard of weather affecting radio transmission at these frequencies. Of course, it would happen now, when I needed contact with the outside world more than ever. I made the mistake of opening Danner's logbook that night, hoping to find some explanation for what I'd experienced. Page after page of his cramped handwriting told a story of gradual deterioration, sanity unraveling one entry at a time. The first entries were professional, routine observations of weather and wildlife. But as the weeks progressed, the tone changed, became increasingly desperate and confused. Day 12 heard voices in the fog. Couldn't make out words, but they sounded familiar. Day 18, she's getting bolder. Stands closer to the tower each night. I think she's trying to tell me something. Day 23, they whisper through the trees when I sleep. I see her now, watching me sleep. Her mouth is gone. She uses mine. Day 29, found footprints inside the tower. Wet. Leading to my bed. Day 35, they crawl under the trapdoor. They whisper through the boards. I can feel them moving down there. Day 41, every night the tower leans closer to the fire that isn't burning. The horizon tilts. North becomes south. Day 47, I woke up with someone else's hands. They're too long. The fingerprints don't match. The handwriting deteriorated with each entry, becoming increasingly erratic, sometimes switching between printing and cursive mid-sentence. Some entries were written in what looked like different hands entirely, as if multiple people had been keeping the log. That's when I found the final entry, scrawled wildly across 2 pages in letters so large and desperate they'd torn through the paper. "If the radio talks first, you're already dead." I slammed the book shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. And from behind me, as if summoned by my discovery, the radio crackled to life. The sound cut through the silence like a blade, analog static mixed with something that might have been a voice. Then, clear as if someone was standing in the room with me, "Ranger Danner, report." I hadn't touched the dial. The power cord was still unplugged, coiled on the floor where I'd left it. The radio was running on no power source I could identify, its amber display glowing with impossible light. And I wasn't Danner. But the voice on the radio seemed to think I was. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't even close my eyes. How could I, with the radio continuing its impossible broadcast? The voice repeated its call every few minutes, always the same words, always in that tone of professional concern that made my skin crawl. Ranger Danner, report. Tower 9, please respond. Sometimes it varied. Danner, we need your position. Or Tower 9, what's your status? But worst of all were the responses. Because someone was answering. Not me. I sat frozen on my cot, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. But the radio crackled with replies in a voice I didn't recognize, though it sounded disturbingly familiar, like hearing a recording of yourself played back wrong. Base, this is Tower 9. Everything's quiet up here. No unusual activity to report. Weather's holding steady. Routine responses that chilled me because I wasn't giving them. The voice was coming from the radio itself, or from something inside the tower that knew exactly what a ranger should say. Something that had been listening to these conversations for years, learning, practicing. When dawn finally came, gray and muted through the persistent fog, I broke protocol and left the tower. The ladder trembled under me more than it should have, metal vibrating with each step as if something heavy was climbing up from below. The air was freezing despite it being mid-July, my breath visible in puffs that hung in the still air longer than physics should allow. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking for any sign of the woman I'd seen. No tracks in the soft earth, no broken branches, no indication that anyone had been there. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, a weight between my shoulder blades that made me constantly look over my shoulder. The fog seemed to follow me, swirling around my legs like curious cats, always just thick enough to obscure my vision at crucial moments. I found myself walking in circles, losing track of direction despite having navigated wilderness for years. The trees all looked the same, twisted in identical ways, and my compass spun lazily without settling on any particular direction. When I finally looked up at the tower, my blood turned to ice water. She was standing on the balcony railing, directly above me, balanced impossibly on the narrow metal bar. No movement to indicate how she'd gotten there. No sign of climbing or walking. She was simply there, as if she materialized from the fog itself. Her head was tilted at an angle that should have been impossible, nearly 90 degrees to the side, and as I watched in horror, it continued to rotate until her melted face was completely upside down. Her empty eye sockets seemed to track my movement, and her mouth, or the place where her mouth should have been, opened in a silent scream that I felt more than heard, a vibration that rattled my bones. I ran. Back to the ladder, up the rungs 2 at a time, my pack bouncing against my spine. Into the observation deck, slamming the hatch behind me with enough force to shake the entire structure. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, certain I'd feel her fingers wrapping around my ankles at any moment. But when I pressed my face to the window and looked down, the balcony was empty. The railing showed no sign that anyone had been standing on it. No footprints, no disturbance in the thin layer of moisture the fog had left behind. I tried to leave a message in the logbook, something for whoever found me if I didn't make it out. My pen moved across the paper, spelling out help. Not alone. Something wrong here. But the ink bled on the paper like it was soaked, the letters spreading and running together until they were illegible. The page absorbed the ink too quickly, as if the paper was thirsty for it, and within minutes my message had become nothing but dark stains. I must have blacked out then, exhaustion and terror finally overwhelming my system. When I woke, it was dark outside, and there was blood on my hands. My palms were raw, torn, as if I'd been clawing at something with desperate strength. The skin under my fingernails was packed with splinters and what looked like rust flakes. My knuckles were bruised, scraped, and when I flexed my fingers, pain shot up my arms. That's when I noticed the scratches on the inside of the trapdoor. Deep gouges in the wood, arranged in sets of 5 fingernail marks. Someone had been trapped below, clawing at the underside of the door with inhuman desperation. The marks were fresh, the wood pale where it had been recently torn. But they weren't my marks. My fingernails were too short, and the spacing was wrong. These scratches had been made by hands larger than mine, with fingers longer than any human should possess. I ripped up one of the floorboards with my crowbar, needing to see what was beneath, needing to understand what had been making those sounds. The space below was larger than it should have been, extending far beyond the tower's foundation. And there, in the dirt directly below where I'd been sleeping, was an eye. Human in shape, but wrong in every other way. Bloodshot, with a pupil that took up too much of the iris. It was embedded in the earth like a marble, but it moved when I looked at it, tracking my position with horrible awareness. It blinked. The eyelid was pale and translucent, and when it closed, I could see the shadow of the pupil moving beneath. When it opened again, the eye had rotated slightly, getting a better angle to watch me. I screamed and fell backward, my crowbar clattering across the floor. But when I forced myself to look again, there was nothing but dirt and shadows. Just ordinary earth, dark and damp, showing no sign that anything had ever been there. But the floor whispered when I walked across it now, creaking and settling in patterns that sounded almost like words. And sometimes, late at night, I could swear I heard breathing coming from the spaces between the boards. Danner hadn't gone mad up here. He'd gone trapped, caught in something that fed on isolation and fear, something that had been waiting in this place for decades. And I was next in line. I finally made contact with base the next morning, after hours of adjusting frequencies and repositioning the radio's makeshift antenna. The radio hummed to life with a clarity that seemed impossible given its condition, and Marshall Grant's voice came through, distant but recognizable. Static crackled around his words, but I could make out enough to understand him. Tower 9? Jesus, you're active? We've been trying to reach you for days. I lost track of time completely. What felt like a week could have been longer or shorter. Time moved differently in the fog, stretched and compressed until it became meaningless. Yes, I said, gripping the microphone too tightly. Marshall, what's going on here? There's something wrong with this place. A long pause, filled with the kind of static that sounds almost like whispering voices. When Marshall's voice returned, it carried a weight I'd never heard before, the tone of a man delivering news he'd hoped never to share. You weren't supposed to be assigned there. Tower 9's been decommissioned since '97. We lost Danner there, and after what happened, we sealed it off. Officially, it doesn't exist. The words hit me like physical blows. Then why was I sent? The paperwork, the assignment, I don't know. You were never on the roster for Tower 9. Hell, you weren't on any roster we have. According to our records, you're on leave this season. I stare at the microphone, my reflection distorted in its metal surface. The face looking back at me was gaunt, hollow-eyed, showing signs of stress I hadn't noticed before. That's impossible. You gave me the assignment yourself. Listen to me carefully, Marshall said, his voice cutting through the static with urgency. I need you to tell me exactly what you've seen up there. Everything. I told him about the woman in the ranger uniform, the sounds from below the floor, the radio that operated without power. About Danner's logbook and the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to act. Marshall listened without interruption, and I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end. There's something you should know, he said finally. The woman you described, she was real. Ranger Lillian Shaw, stationed at Tower 9 in 1978. There was a lightning strike during a storm. The tower caught fire, and she was trapped in the crawl space below when the stairs collapsed. She died there, locked in that space, calling for help that never came. My hands were shaking now, making it hard to hold the microphone steady. She's still here, Marshall. She's still trying to get out. No, Marshall said, and his voice carried a strange certainty. That tower burned to the ground in '78. Shaw died in the fire, but the tower was completely destroyed. What you're seeing. I looked around the observation deck at the wooden walls, the intact windows, the furniture that showed no signs of fire damage. But now that he mentioned it, I could see the scorch marks I'd somehow missed before. Dark stains on the beams that could have been shadows but weren't. The smell of smoke that I'd attributed to the mountain air was stronger here, embedded in the very structure. My knees buckled as understanding hit me. I wasn't in Tower Number 9. I was in what was left of Tower Number 9, the ghost of a structure that had burned down decades ago. The tower existed only for those who were meant to see it, meant to experience what Shaw had experienced in her final moments. And I was never supposed to be able to see it. Only people marked by her fire could find this place, could climb the ladder that shouldn't exist, could open doors that had burned away years ago. People who shared something with her, some connection that transcended death and destruction. I opened Danner's logbook again with trembling hands. The pages had changed. Entries I'd read before were different now, written in handwriting I slowly recognized as my own. The dates were wrong too, spanning not just Danner's time here, but years before and after. Ranger Shaw, Day 1. Storm approaching from the west. Ranger Danner, Day 15. She speaks through the walls now. Ranger, my name, Day 3. Cried today. Don't know why. Day 7. Forgot his mother's name. Lillian remembers it for him. Day 8. Sleeps with eyes open now. Easier to watch that way. Day 9. Trapdoor unlocked. She is pleased. Soon. I slammed the book shut, but my hands were shaking so violently I could barely maintain my grip. The entries were writing themselves, documenting my experience in real time. But worse than that, they were documenting experiences I hadn't had yet, predicting a future I was apparently destined to live. Because according to the log, I hadn't unlocked the trapdoor. But I was going to. They found me 3 days later, though by then the concept of time had become meaningless. I was wandering the valley miles away from where Tower Number 9 should have been, my clothes charred and smoking, but my skin strangely unburned. My boots were melted to my feet, the rubber soles fused with flesh, but I felt no pain. My eyes were wide and unblinking, pupils dilated so far they'd nearly swallowed the iris completely. The search team said I'd been walking in perfect circles, my path worn into the earth like a ritual ground. When they called my name, I didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge their presence. I was muttering the same phrase over and over, the words spilling from my lips in an endless loop. The tower leans. The fire breathes. The floor listens. She's coming up. She's coming up. She's coming up. They tried to ask me about what had happened, where I'd been, how I'd gotten so far from my assigned position. But I couldn't form coherent sentences anymore. The words in my head belonged to someone else, spoke of experiences that weren't mine but felt more real than my own memories. They brought me to a hospital in the valley, strapped me to a bed when I kept trying to walk back toward the mountains. The doctors ran tests, took x-rays, drew blood samples that came back with impossible results. My body showed signs of prolonged exposure to extreme heat, but there were no burns. My lungs were clear, but somehow held traces of smoke from fires that had burned decades ago. When I finally awoke from whatever fugue state had claimed me, truly awoke with something approaching clarity, there was a logbook beside my bed. Old leather binding, worn smooth by countless hands. Smelling of smoke and something else, something organic and wrong. The pages were yellow with age, brittle around the edges, but the writing inside was fresh. I didn't open it. Couldn't bring myself to touch it. But I could see the cover, could read the names embossed there in faded gold lettering. Tower 9. Shaw. Danner. My name. And below that, in fresher ink, other names I didn't recognize. Future names. People who hadn't been born yet, or who were still children, unaware that their paths would eventually lead them to a tower that didn't exist, to answer a call that had been echoing through the mountains for decades. I'm not allowed back in the field now, not after what I told them. The official report lists my condition as acute stress reaction with psychotic features, brought on by isolation and altitude sickness. They've given me a desk job, filing reports and updating databases, keeping me safely away from the wilderness that I once loved. But sometimes, on clear nights when I'm working late in the office, I see it in the distance through the window. A blinking red light where the mountains meet the sky, too far away to be anything earthly, too regular to be a star. On a tower that doesn't exist, in a place that burned down before I was born. And the radio beside my bed, the old transistor radio the hospital let me keep, crackles to life in the early hours of the morning, when the boundary between sleep and waking grows thin. Come down. We need help below. The voice is different each time. Sometimes it's Shaw, speaking through melted lips about the fire that never ends. Sometimes it's Danner, pleading for someone to unlock the trapdoor, to let him out of the space where he's been trapped for 25 years. And sometimes, most terrifying of all, it's my own voice, calling from a future I haven't lived yet, warning me about something I can't quite remember, but know I should fear. If you're ever offered a job in a fire watch tower, especially one that's been empty for years, especially one with a history the supervisors don't want to discuss, say no. Walk away. Find other work. Some heights aren't meant to be watched from. Some fires never go out, they just wait for new fuel. And some towers keep calling long after they've burned to the ground, seeking new residents for rooms that exist only in the space between memory and nightmare. The red light is blinking again tonight. I can see it from my apartment window, steady and patient, a lighthouse for the lost and desperate. And I think, God help me, I think I want to answer. I'd walked past Broken Falls 1,000 times. Its cascading waters a tranquil backdrop to my patrols. The sound had become white noise to me, as familiar as my own breathing. During summer months, I'd watch families spread picnic blankets on the moss-covered rocks, children shrieking with delight as mist kissed their faces. During winter, the falls would freeze into crystalline sculptures that drew photographers from 3 states over. But the night I heard the echoes beneath the roar, I realized serenity often masks something far more sinister. The call came during my late shift, just past 2 a.m. when the radio crackled to life with that particular urgency that makes your stomach drop. A hiker reported ghostly singing drifting from the fall's undercut basin. The dispatcher's voice was tight. She'd fielded enough prank calls to know when someone was genuinely terrified. This wasn't a prank. I grabbed my helmet light, checked my radio twice, and descended the familiar trail that suddenly felt foreign in the darkness. The beam of my flashlight seemed weaker than usual, swallowed by shadows that pressed in from all sides. Every step echoed differently, not the usual crunch of leaves and snap of twigs, but something hollow, as if I were walking over a vast emptiness. Half expecting to find drunk teenagers or someone high on mushrooms, I called out as I approached the falls. Park Service. Anyone down here? What I found instead was silence. A kind that wasn't natural. No crickets chirping their midnight symphony. No rush of water thundering against stone. No rustling of nocturnal creatures in the underbrush. Just emptiness. An absence so complete it felt like a presence itself, pressing against my eardrums until they ached. The falls themselves still moved. I could see the water cascading down in the moonlight, but they made no sound. It was as if someone had pressed a cosmic mute button, draining the world of its voice. Then the sound began again. But it wasn't singing. It was whispering. Hundreds of voices, maybe thousands, layering over each other like an audio recording played backward, speaking at once. In different languages, some I recognized as Spanish, French, what might have been Cherokee. Others were completely foreign, syllables that human tongues shouldn't be able to form. Some pleading with desperate urgency. Others laughing with a joy so pure it made my skin crawl. I stood frozen, my flashlight beam wavering as my hands began to shake. The whispers rose and fell like breathing, and within that rhythm, I began to make out individual words. Help us. So lonely. Come closer. It's beautiful down here. And then, just beneath the noise, so quiet I almost missed it, I heard my own voice whisper back. It said, "Come home." The beam of my flashlight jerked as I stumbled backward, my boot catching a root. I dropped the light, and it rolled across the wet stones, casting wild shadows that seemed to reach for me with grasping fingers. When I finally grabbed it and steadied the beam, I saw them. Footprints, bare, wet footprints, leading straight into what should have been solid rock behind the falls. But there was a cave there now. There's no marked cave on any map. I'd studied every geological survey of this area, walked these trails in every season for 7 years. I'd have seen it, known it. The rock face behind Broken Falls was solid granite, worn smooth by centuries of water flow. But it was there now. A jagged mouth in the stone, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Water dripped from its edges like saliva, and from within came a breeze that smelled of wet earth and something else, something organic and wrong. And it was waiting. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I could feel them pulling at me, not with physical force, but with something deeper. A longing I didn't understand, a homesickness for a place I'd never been. I took one step toward the cave mouth, then another. My radio crackled, jolting me back to reality. The dispatcher's voice was distorted, barely recognizable. Unit 7, report your status. I fumbled for the radio, never taking my eyes off the cave. This is Unit 7. I'm at the falls. There's something here. Static answered me. When I looked back, the cave mouth seemed larger, hungrier. I ran. If you ever visit Broken Falls, and you hear what sounds like voices below the roar, don't follow them. Don't go down there. Because once you step into the cavern, the only thing that echoes back is your fear. And eventually, your soul. Broken Falls was always the most photographed spot in our park. People loved how the water came down in split tiers, each cascade catching the light differently, framing a crystalline pool at the bottom that reflected the sky like a broken mirror. It was postcard material, the kind of natural beauty that made people believe in something greater than themselves. Tourists would hike 3 miles in boots they'd never broken in, cameras bouncing against their chests, just to capture that perfect shot. But to locals and rangers like me, it had a different name, the Widow's Mouth. Old folklore. Something the Cherokee had whispered about long before the first settlers arrived, before the Park Service drew its neat lines and built its tidy trails. They said the rock face below the falls was hollow, like a throat. The mountain's throat. They said the water didn't just flow over the stones. It trickled into a hidden cavern where the mountain swallowed up anything that tried to climb inside. Children who got too close to the edge. Hunters who stayed too long after dark. Young women who came to the falls during the full moon, drawn by dreams they couldn't explain. The stories changed with each telling, but the core remained the same. Something lived beneath Broken Falls. Something that was always hungry. I didn't believe it. Rangers learned to separate fact from fiction early in their careers, to distinguish between genuine threats and campfire stories designed to thrill tourists. Every park has its legends, phantom hitchhikers, ghostly Confederate soldiers, creatures that couldn't possibly exist. Broken Falls was just another pretty waterfall with a colorful backstory. Not until that night. The hiker who called it in was a guy named Devin. Mid-20s, traveling alone, backpacking across state parks with a kind of determination that spoke of someone running from something. His voice cracked when he spoke, not with puberty, but with genuine terror. He sounded like a man who'd seen the edge of the world and found it staring back. I wasn't even close to the edge, he said, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to get them out. I was just resting on the ridge, maybe 50 yards back from the falls. I'd been hiking all day, and my feet were killing me, so I found this flat rock and sat down to eat some trail mix. I pressed for details, pen poised over my incident report form. What time was this? Maybe 9 p.m.? The sun had just set, but there was still light. You know, that purple twilight when everything looked softer. He paused, and I could hear him breathing heavily through the phone. I was just sitting there, listening to the water when I heard it. Like chanting, then singing. Multiple voices, harmonizing. It was beautiful at first. Really beautiful. Could it have been other hikers? Maybe someone with a radio. He hesitated, and in that pause I heard something that made my pen stop moving. Fear. Real, bone-deep fear. It sounded like my grandma, he whispered. Her voice calling my name. But she's been dead 3 years. I buried her myself. I set down my pen. Devin, are you sure you? I know how this sounds, he interrupted. I know you probably think I'm crazy or high or whatever, but I swear to God, it was her voice. She was calling me down there, telling me she'd been waiting for me, that she was cold and needed me to come warm her up. The line went quiet except for his ragged breathing. What did you do? I asked. I ran, he said simply. I packed up my gear and ran back to the campsite as fast as I could. But I could hear her voice following me the whole way, getting fainter, but never really gone. Even now, sitting in my tent, I can still hear it if I listen hard enough. I told him to wait at the campsite, that I'd check it out and file a report. Standard procedure for noise complaints, even unusual ones. But as I hung up the phone and gathered my gear, something cold settled in my stomach. Maybe it was Devin's conviction, or maybe it was the way the forest outside the ranger station had gone completely silent while we talked. The hike to the falls should have taken 20 minutes. I'd walked that trail so many times I could navigate it blindfolded. But that night, something was different. The forest grew darker than usual, even though the moon was out, full and bright. The canopy seemed denser, the shadows deeper and more twisted. Tree branches that I'd never noticed before reached across the path like gnarled fingers, forcing me to duck and weave. The path itself twisted strangely, bending in directions I didn't remember. Familiar landmarks, the lightning-split oak, the boulder that looked like a sleeping bear, appeared in the wrong places or not at all. I found myself checking my compass every few minutes, certain I'd somehow gotten turned around on a trail I could walk in my sleep. I had to use my flashlight far earlier than expected, its beam seeming weaker and more diffused than usual. The darkness pressed in from all sides, so thick it felt almost solid. My footsteps echoed wrong, not with the usual crunch of leaves, but with a hollow sound, as if I were walking over empty space. When I finally arrived at the falls, everything felt off. The roar of the water seemed quieter, not just muffled, but actively suppressed, like someone had thrown a heavy blanket over the entire area. The mist that usually rose from the pool at the bottom hung in the air like fog, unmoving despite the breeze that rustled the trees around me. I crouched at the bottom tier, where Devin said he'd been sitting, and waited. My radio was clipped to my shoulder, my flashlight in one hand, my other hand resting on the pepper spray at my belt. Standard precautions, but they felt inadequate somehow. Nothing at first, just that unnatural quiet and the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Then a low, collective murmur. It started so quietly, I almost missed it beneath the reduced sound of the falls. But it grew stronger, more distinct. Not one voice, but many, speaking in unison. The words were unclear, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, hungry. I leaned closer to the water's edge, training my flashlight beam along the base of the falls. And that's when I saw the opening behind the cascade. A jagged crack in the stone, hidden behind the curtain of water, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It hadn't been there before. I was certain of that. I'd photographed these falls from every angle, had studied the geological surveys, had even helped with a scientific study of water erosion patterns the previous summer. There had been no cave, and there shouldn't have been one now. But as I watched, paralyzed by a mixture of professional curiosity and primal fear, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A pale hand pressed against the inside of the cave opening, fingers splayed against the stone. Then another hand. Then faces, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, pressing against what should have been solid rock as if it were glass. Their mouths were moving, speaking words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. They were calling my name. The cave mouth was just wide enough to squeeze through, its edges jagged and wet like the inside of something's throat. Water streamed over the opening in thin curtains, but not enough to completely obscure the darkness beyond. In daylight, you wouldn't notice it unless you knew exactly where to look, and even then, it appeared more like a shadow between the rocks than an actual passage. I stood at the water's edge for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, my flashlight beam wavering as my hand shook. Every instinct I developed in 7 years of park service screamed at me to back away, to call for backup, to return in the morning with a full team and proper equipment. Instead, I found myself pulling the climbing rope from my pack. I should have radioed for backup. The protocol was clear. Never enter an unmapped cave system alone, especially not at night. But something about the whispers made me hesitate to use the radio. What if the voices came through the speaker? What if they heard me calling for help and knew I was afraid? I tied one end of the rope around the thickest root I could find, a gnarled oak root that had been exposed by years of erosion. The rope was rated for 200 pounds, and I tested it twice before clipping the other end to my belt. I didn't expect to go far, just enough to confirm the cave was empty, maybe get some photos for the report, prove to myself that there was a logical explanation for everything I'd seen and heard. The moment I stepped through the waterfall, the world changed. The sound of rushing water disappeared completely, not fading gradually, but cutting off like someone had flipped a switch. My boots, which had been splashing through ankle-deep water, suddenly found solid, dry stone. The air temperature dropped at least 20 degrees, and my breath became visible in small puffs that dissipated too quickly, as if the cave were actively absorbing them. But it wasn't the physical changes that made my skin crawl. It was the breathing. Slow, steady, rhythmic. Not the echo of my own breathing, but something else entirely. Something massive, as if the cave itself were alive and sleeping. Each inhale seemed to draw the air from my lungs, and each exhale brought a warmth that smelled of copper and decay. My flashlight flickered once, the beam dimming almost to nothing before suddenly blazing brighter than it ever had before. In that enhanced light, I could see the cave stretched much deeper than it had appeared from outside. The walls weren't rough natural stone, but had been worn smooth, almost polished, by something other than water. Strange patterns covered every surface, not carvings exactly, but grooves that spiraled and curved in ways that hurt to look at directly. The tunnel bent downward in a natural spiral, following the contours of the mountain's interior. But as I descended, I noticed the passage wasn't just following natural geology. The turns were too perfect, too deliberate. Someone or something had shaped this place with intention. The grooves on the walls became deeper, more elaborate. Some looked like flowing water frozen in stone. Others resembled claw marks, but no animal I knew of had claws that wide or that long. A few looked disturbingly like finger marks, as if someone had dragged their hands along the walls while walking, or being dragged deeper into the darkness. I got maybe 50 feet when the whispers began again. At first, they were low and distant, like conversations heard through thick walls. But as I descended, they surrounded me, seeming to come from the stone itself. The voices were clearer now, distinct enough that I could make out individual words, though they were spoken in languages I didn't recognize. Some sounded joyous, like laughter at a reunion or celebration. Others begged in broken fragments, switching between languages mid-sentence. "Help me, G&E Purpa, please, I can't find a way. Stay with us. Stay. It's so warm here, so safe. Do you know your name? I've forgotten mine. Mama? Is that you, Mama? I've been waiting so long." I stopped walking and spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The tunnel behind me looked exactly as it had when I'd entered. No footprints in the dust except my own, no disturbance in the strange patterns on the walls. No one there. But the voices continued, growing more urgent, more personal. I heard names being called, some familiar, some foreign. I heard what sounded like prayers in half a dozen languages. I heard weeping that made my chest ache with sympathy I didn't understand. The air grew colder with each step. My breath came out in thick clouds now, and frost began forming on the walls around me. The moisture in the air crystallized into delicate, impossible shapes, not random ice patterns, but deliberate designs that almost looked like writing. I turned another corner and found myself in a cavern so vast that my flashlight couldn't penetrate to the other side. The ceiling disappeared into blackness above me, and the floor was perfectly smooth, almost mirror-like. But it wasn't water. It was stone polished to a shine that reflected my light in fractured, distorted patterns. In the center of the cavern stood a monolith, 10 feet tall, maybe 12, carved from the same black stone as the floor. It was covered in the same type of grooves I'd seen on the walls, but these were deeper, more complex. They spiraled around the stone like a three-dimensional map of something I couldn't comprehend. And it was moving. Not the stone itself, but something within it. Veins of pale light pulsed beneath the surface, following the carved channels like luminescent blood. The light was cold and sickly, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of my flashlight beam. The whispers stopped. Complete silence fell over the cavern, so absolute that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing off the walls. Even the mysterious breathing that had followed me down the tunnel ceased. Then a single voice replaced them all. My own voice. It came from the monolith, from the pulsing veins of light within the stone. But it was wrong. The tone was right, the inflection familiar, but the words were ones I'd never spoken. You belong to her now. You always have. You just forgot for a while. The rope clipped to my belt suddenly went taut. Not slowly, as if someone were pulling on it from above, but violently, jerking me backward with enough force to lift me off my feet. I fell hard onto the stone floor, my flashlight spinning away from me, its beam creating a wild strobe effect as it rolled. In that stuttering light, I caught glimpses of movement around a monolith. Shapes that might have been human, or might have been something else entirely. They moved wrong, too fluid in some places, too jerky in others, like marionettes controlled by a drunk puppeteer. My flashlight struck the base of the monolith and shattered. Darkness swallowed me completely. But I wasn't alone down there. The breathing had returned, but now it was coming from all around me. Not one set of lungs, but dozens, maybe hundreds, all synchronized in a rhythm that seemed to match my own panic heartbeat. And in that breathing, I could feel her presence. Not human, but not entirely inhuman either. Something ancient and patient and infinitely hungry. Something that had been waiting in the dark beneath Broken Falls for longer than the trees above had been growing. She didn't speak, but I heard her voice anyway, not in my ears, but directly in my mind. Welcome home. And I realized, with a terror so complete it nearly stopped my heart, that part of me, some deep, buried part that I'd never acknowledged, recognized her voice. I had been here before. Pitch black. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was a presence unto itself, thick and oppressive, pressing against my skin like wet cloth. I could feel it seeping into my lungs with each breath, coating my throat with something that tasted of copper and forgotten names. Except for a faint glow pulsing from within the monolith. Like veins under translucent skin, the light moved in slow, hypnotic patterns that seemed to follow the rhythm of my heartbeat. Faint and wrong, but the only thing keeping me from complete madness in the absolute dark. Then came the footsteps. Not one set, dozens. Bare feet slapping against wet stone, creating a sound like scattered applause. But the rhythm was off, some footsteps fell in sync with others, while some seemed to be walking to entirely different beats, as if each person was moving through their own version of time. They circled me in the dark, never getting close enough for me to see them in the monolith's pale glow, but near enough that I could feel the displaced air from their movement. The sound of their breathing joined the footsteps, rasping, labored, as if each breath were being drawn through damaged lungs. I crawled backward until my hands found a jagged edge, part of the cavern wall. The stone was wet and warm, almost feverish to the touch. Strange patterns were carved here too, but these felt different under my fingertips. Fresher, as if they'd been made recently. My training kicked in. Stay still. Listen. Don't panic. Assess the situation. Find an exit. But panic was all I had left. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched out for long seconds, broken only by the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness. I pressed my back against the wall and tried to control my breathing, Try to think like a ranger instead of like prey. Then I heard her voice, a woman's, soft, familiar in a way that made my chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Why did you leave me there? It was my mother's voice, but she'd never spoken like that. My mother had been gentle, yes, but there was something else in this voice, a hunger that made each word sound like it was being savored, a loneliness so deep it had turned predatory. I waited so long for you to come back. The voice continued, and now I could hear the speaker moving through the darkness, circling me slowly. I called your name every night for 30 years. My mother had been dead for 15 years. Come back inside. It's warmer here. So much warmer than up there in the cold world. No more lonely nights. No more empty beds. Just us forever and ever. I shouted into the darkness, my voice cracking with terror and rage. You're not real. You're not her. The whispering voices that had been silent since I entered the cavern suddenly erupted in a chorus of hisses and shrieks that seemed to come from the walls themselves. They layered over each other in a cacophony of languages and emotions, anger, desperation, jealousy, and something else that might have been relief, as if they were relieved that someone else would be joining them. Then came the faces. They materialized one by one in the glowing veins on the monolith surface, trapped, writhing, whispering silently to themselves or to each other. Some were rotted beyond recognition, just skulls with wisps of hair clinging to yellowed bone. Others were pristine, so perfectly preserved they might have been sleeping, except for their eyes, which moved constantly, searching the darkness for something they would never find. All were screaming without sound. I could see their mouths forming words, their faces contorted with emotions too intense for the human mind to process. Some beat against the inside of the stone as if it were glass. Others simply stared out with expressions of such profound despair that looking at them felt like drowning. And among them, I saw faces I recognized. Not personally, but from missing person reports. From old photographs and police files. A teenage girl who disappeared while camping with her family in 1987. A park maintenance worker who'd vanished during a routine trail inspection in 1994. A young couple who'd been hiking the Falls Trail on their honeymoon and were never seen again. They were all here. All of them. Preserved in the stone like insects in amber, but still aware, still conscious, still screaming. I turned to run, but the passage behind me had changed. Where the tunnel should have been, there was only a flat wall, covered in the same spiral patterns as everything else in this place. The cave had shifted while I wasn't looking, sealing itself like a wound. The cave had closed behind me. I was trapped. That's when I saw the figure crouching beside the monolith. A woman in ranger uniform, the same green and brown that I wore, but faded and stained with substances I didn't want to identify. Her back was to me, but I could see that her uniform hung wrong, as if the body inside it had changed shape. She was humming something, a lullaby maybe, or a hymn. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, and despite everything, I found myself taking a step closer. Hello, I called out, my voice barely a whisper. She stopped humming. Slowly, so slowly it seemed to take minutes, she turned to face me. Her skin had sloughed away in places, revealing bone that gleamed wetly in the monolith's glow. Her jaw hung at an unnatural angle, as if it had been broken and healed wrong. One eye socket was empty, just a dark hollow that seemed to go deeper than her skull should have allowed. The other eye was intact but wrong, too large, too knowing, reflecting light like an animal's. She smiled with cracked teeth, and when she spoke, her voice was the sound of wind through dry leaves. You're the first one to hear them in years, she rasped, tilting her head at an angle that should have been impossible. Most people just hear water. Just noise. But you heard their voices. Their real voices. Who are you? I stammered, though part of me already knew the answer. She tilted her head the other way, and I heard vertebrae cracking. I was you. I walked the same trails, wore the same uniform, carried the same radio. I thought I was protecting people. She gestured toward the faces in the monolith, and her arm moved with joints that bent in too many places. But I was feeding them instead. Every missing person report I filed, every search I conducted, every time I told a family their loved one was probably just lost in the woods, I was gathering them for her. Her. The woman's broken smile widened. The mother. The first voice. The one who's been waiting longest of all. As she spoke, the monolith pulsed brighter, and I could see deeper into its structure. It wasn't solid stone, it was hollow, and inside was something that had once been human but had grown into something else entirely. Something with too many arms, too many faces, too many mouths that whispered in voices stolen from the trapped souls. The mother. And she was beautiful. Not in any conventional sense, but with the terrible beauty of a predator perfectly adapted to its environment. She moved like liquid shadow, and when she opened her eyes, all 6 of them, they held the accumulated loneliness of everyone who had ever felt unloved, unwanted, forgotten. She spoke without moving any of her mouths, her voice filling the cavern. I have been so lonely. So very, very lonely. But you'll stay with me, won't you? You'll keep me company in the dark. The woman in the ranger uniform began to dissolve, her form becoming mist that was drawn into the cracks in the floor. And from those same cracks, dozens of hands reached out, pulling at the stone, at the air, at reality itself, trying to climb free from whatever hell lay beneath this place. I fled toward what I hoped was another tunnel, anywhere that led away from the mother and her terrible hunger. Behind me, the entire cavern breathed with the rhythm of something vast waking up, and the stone whispered in my mother's voice, "You'll come back. They all do. I'll make sure you always know the way home." I ran blind through passages that twisted and writhed like living things, my hands scraping against walls that felt more like flesh than stone. The darkness was absolute, but somehow I could sense the turns and drops before I reached them, as if the mountain itself were guiding my steps. Behind me, the mother's laughter echoed through the tunnels, not cruel, but patient and almost fond, like a parent watching a child play hide and seek. She knew I couldn't truly escape. This was her domain, and every passage, every chamber, every crack in the stone was part of her body. But still I ran. The tunnel I'd chosen, or that had chosen me, sloped steadily upward, and gradually the air began to taste less of copper and more of earth. Real earth, not the strange, processed atmosphere of the cavern below. My lungs, which had been struggling in the thick air around a monolith, began to work normally again. I emerged hours later, or maybe days. Time moved strangely in the mother's realm, into a shaft that led upward through crumbling steps carved directly into the rock. Each step was worn smooth by countless feet, and in some places, I could see handprints worn into the stone walls where desperate climbers had sought purchase. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely climb, but terror drove me upward. My flashlight was long dead, shattered in the cavern below, but a faint light filtered down from above, not sunlight, but something close enough to it that my eyes wept with relief. The air smelled like rust and bones, and something else, something organic and wrong, like flowers left too long in a closed room. But it was still better than the suffocating atmosphere of the mother's chamber. At the top of the shaft, I found a rusted ladder bolted to the rock, leading to a metal hatch that looked like it belonged on a submarine. The metal was corroded, bleeding orange stains down the stone, but it was solid enough to support my weight. I pushed against the hatch with everything I had left. It resisted at first, sealed by decades of rust and neglect, but finally gave way with a shriek of protest that echoed down the shaft. Sweet, clean air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine needles and morning dew. Daylight. Real daylight, not the sickly glow of the monolith or the false illumination of fluorescent bulbs. I tumbled out of the hatch and onto a bed of moss and fallen leaves, gasping like a man who'd been drowning. I was in the forest, but not where I expected to be. The trees were different here, older, more gnarled, covered in moss that hung from their branches like funeral shrouds. The underbrush was thick and tangled, as if no one had walked this way in decades. Through the trees, I could see a dirt road, not one of the modern park roads, but something older, barely more than 2 ruts worn into the earth. A wooden sign, weathered and barely legible, read, Fire Access Road, authorized personnel only 19 to 62. I was at least 2 miles from Broken Falls, in a section of the park that had been closed to public access since before I was born. The hike back to the station took me 3 hours. My legs gave out twice, forcing me to rest against trees that seemed to lean away from me as if I carried some contamination from the depths. Birds fell silent when I passed. Small animals fled into the underbrush. I was covered in grime that wouldn't come off no matter how hard I scrubbed, and blood that wasn't mine, dark, thick blood that smelled of minerals and time. My uniform was torn in places I didn't remember tearing it, and there were marks on my arms that looked almost like bite marks, though I had no memory of being bitten. When I finally made it back to the ranger station, it was noon on what should have been the next day, but the calendar on the wall insisted that 3 days had passed. 3 days that existed nowhere in my memory except as a blur of darkness and whispers and the terrible, patient smile of something that had been waiting in the deep places of the world since before humans learned to fear the dark. When I filed the report, no one believed me. The story was too impossible, too detailed, too specific to be a hallucination, but too bizarre to be real. The other rangers exchanged glances when they thought I wasn't looking. The park supervisor suggested I take some time off, maybe talk to someone about the stress of the job. But Sarah, the oldest ranger, the one who'd been working these mountains since the 1970s, pulled me aside after the briefing. "You saw the mother stone," she whispered, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "The what?" She locked her eyes with mine, and I saw something there I'd never noticed before. Haunted quality, as if she were seeing something just over my shoulder that terrified her. The mountain's womb, the place where the first voices gathered. People think the falls are beautiful because the sound soothes them, because there's something peaceful about running water. She shook her head slowly. But it's not water they're hearing. It's voices. Thousands of them. Crying out from below, begging to be remembered, begging for someone to join them so they won't be alone anymore. The water just carries the sound up, makes it seem natural, makes it seem safe. I stared at her, seeing my own experience reflected in her eyes. "How do you know this?" Sarah rolled up her sleeve with trembling fingers. Carved into her arm, from wrist to elbow, were tiny, shallow grooves. The same spiral patterns I'd seen on the walls of the cavern, but smaller, more delicate. They looked like they'd been made with something sharp and precise, cut so carefully that they'd healed without leaving keloid scars. "Sometimes they speak through me," she said, her voice barely audible. "When the moon is dark and the falls run low, I can feel them moving under my skin. They show me things. Memories of people who came before, who heard the mother's call and couldn't resist." She traced one of the patterns with her finger, and I could swear I saw it pulse with faint light. But not all the time. Just when she needs me to remember something important. When she wants me to be ready. Ready for what? Sarah's smile was sad and knowing. For the next one. For the next person who hears their real voices instead of just water. I asked her about the woman in the cave, the ranger who'd claimed to be like me. Sarah's face went white as bone. Her name was Beth. Ranger Beth Carmichael. Vanished in October of '89 during what should have been a routine patrol. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "We found her radio at the base of the falls, right at the water's edge. Her flashlight was there too, still working, beam pointing straight at the rock face behind the cascade. What did the official report say? That she slipped near the edge, lost her footing on wet rocks, fell into the pool, and was swept downstream. We searched for weeks, dragged every inch of the river for miles. Never found a body." Sarah's hands were shaking now, the carved patterns on her arm seeming to writhe in the fluorescent light of the break room. "But I knew better." "You knew?" "I'd been hearing the voices for months before Beth disappeared. Started with just whispers at night when I was alone in the watchtower. Then I began finding things, personal items that belonged to people who'd gone missing over the years. A class ring from 1973. A child's sneaker from 1981. A wedding band that was still warm to the touch, though its owner had vanished in the middle of winter. Sarah pulled a small wooden box from her locker and opened it with reverent care. Inside were dozens of items: jewelry, keys, photographs, small personal effects that looked like they'd been carefully preserved. Each was tagged with a date and a name. Beth was the first one to actually go down there. The first one to answer the call directly instead of just collecting evidence. She touched one of the photographs, a young woman in ranger uniform, smiling at the camera with genuine warmth. I tried to warn her. Tried to tell her about the voices, about the things I'd been finding. But she thought I was losing my mind. Maybe she was right to be skeptical. Sarah's laugh was bitter. Maybe. Or maybe she was just too rational, too grounded in the real world to understand that some things can't be explained with logic and science. She closed the box and locked it away. Either way, she went down there to prove me wrong. To show that there was nothing supernatural about Broken Falls. That was just a waterfall with some unusual acoustics. But she didn't come back up. Oh, but she did. Sarah's eyes met mine again, and in them I saw the terrible knowledge of someone who'd witnessed something that should have been impossible. 3 days later, I was doing my evening rounds when I saw her walking up the trail from the falls. Same uniform, same confident stride, same Beth Carmichael I'd worked with for 2 years. What did you do? I called out to her. Asked where she'd been, if she was hurt, why she hadn't radioed in. She turned around and smiled at me, the same smile she'd always had, and said she'd been exploring some caves she discovered behind the falls. Said she'd lost track of time. Sarah's voice dropped to barely a whisper. But her eyes were wrong. Not the color, they were still brown, still Beth's eyes. But the expression in them was different. Older. Hungrier. And when she spoke, I could hear other voices underneath hers, like an echo that came before the original sound. What happened to her? She worked her shifts for another 2 weeks. Filed her reports, patrolled her assigned areas, interacted with visitors exactly like she always had. But the other rangers started to notice things. She never ate anymore, would sit in the break room with a sandwich and just move it around on her plate. She stopped sleeping, but somehow never seemed tired. And when she thought no one was looking, she would stand perfectly still for minutes at a time, not even breathing. Sarah shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself as if she were cold. Then one morning, her uniform was found folded neatly on her bed in the staff quarters. No explanation. Just the uniform and the smell of wet stone and something organic that made everyone who entered the room feel nauseous. She paused. That was the last time anyone saw Beth Carmichael. But the woman in the cave wasn't Beth anymore. Hadn't been Beth since the moment she stepped through that waterfall. Sarah's carved arm was glowing now, the patterns pulsing with the same pale light I'd seen in the monolith. The mother doesn't just collect people. She studies them first, learns how they move, how they think, how they interact with the world. Then she sends them back up to gather more. The implications hit me like a physical blow. How many others? Over the decades? Dozens, maybe hundreds. Most people don't notice the differences. A spouse who's become emotionally distant, a friend who's developed strange new habits, a coworker who no longer seems quite human in small, indefinable ways. They might notice that something's off, but they rationalize it. People change, they tell themselves. Stress, depression, trauma, there are 1,000 explanations that make more sense than the truth. And you've been keeping track of all this? Sarah nodded grimly. Someone has to. Someone has to remember who they were before the mother claimed them. Because once she has them, they forget themselves completely. They become extensions of her will, gatherers for her collection. She opened another locker and pulled out a thick folder stuffed with papers, photographs, newspaper clippings, missing person reports, handwritten notes, and a dozen different handwritings. Every disappearance in a 50-mile radius for the past 30 years. Every unexplained accident. Every person who just vanished without a trace. Cross-referenced with lunar cycles, weather patterns, geological surveys, even tourism statistics. She spread the papers across the break room table. There's a pattern if you know how to look for it. I studied the documents, seeing connections I hadn't noticed before. Disappearances clustered around certain times of year, always during the new moon, always when the water level at the falls was at its lowest. Always people who were alone, isolated, vulnerable to voices that whispered in the darkness. She's not random, I realized. She's selective, very selective. She doesn't want just anyone. She wants people who are already lost, already searching for something they can't name. People who are so lonely, so disconnected from the world, that the promise of eternal companionship sounds like salvation instead of damnation. I thought about my own life, the failed marriage, the isolated job, the way I'd thrown myself into work to avoid dealing with the emptiness at home. The way the mother's voice had sounded almost familiar. "That's why you were chosen," Sarah said, as if reading my thoughts. "Not because you happened to be on duty that night, but because you were ready to hear her call. Because part of you wanted to answer it. She wasn't wrong. But I got away." "Did you?" Sarah's smile was sad and knowing. "Or did she let you go because she has other plans for you?" Before I could ask what she meant, the radio on my belt crackled to life. The dispatcher's voice was tense, urgent. "All units, we have a missing person report. Hiker last seen heading toward Broken Falls approximately 6 hours ago. Single male, mid-20s, traveling alone." Sarah and I looked at each other across the table, covered in evidence of the mother's patience and hunger. "His name is Devin," I said quietly. Sarah nodded. "She's been waiting for him to come back. They always come back once they've heard her voice." And I realized, with horror that went deeper than fear, that I understood exactly how Devin felt. Because even sitting in the bright, safe break room of the ranger station, surrounded by colleagues and normal, rational explanations for everything I'd experienced, I could still hear her calling. "Come home. Come home. Come home." The whisper followed me everywhere now, a constant presence just below the threshold of hearing. In the wind through the trees, in the distant sound of the falls, in the static between radio transmissions. She hadn't let me go. She'd sent me back to do exactly what Beth had done, what Sarah had been doing for decades, what countless others had done before us. To gather the lost ones, to bring them home. I don't go near the falls anymore. Even when hikers report strange sounds, or someone claims they saw a figure behind a cascade waving at them from the shadows, I pass the call to someone else. I make excuses, scheduling conflicts, equipment issues, other priorities that need my attention. The other rangers think I'm dealing with PTSD from whatever happened that night, and I let them believe it. It's easier than the truth. But late at night, when I'm alone in the watchtower doing paperwork by the pale glow of fluorescent bulbs, I still hear her. The whisper. "Come home." It's in my dreams, woven through every moment of sleep until I wake gasping and disoriented, not sure if I'm in my own bed or lying on cold stone in the deep places of the earth. It's in the rustle of leaves outside my window, in the distant hum of traffic on the highway, in the quiet conversations of visitors discussing their hiking plans. Sometimes I wake up with water on my boots, though I haven't been near the falls in months. The water is always ice cold, and it tastes of minerals and something else, something organic that makes my stomach turn. I tell myself it's condensation from the old pipes in the staff quarters, but I know that's a lie. Sometimes the incident logs shift when I'm not looking, showing entries I didn't write in handwriting that looks almost like mine but isn't quite right. Reports of missing persons who don't exist, search operations that never happened, evidence of disappearances that haven't occurred yet but somehow feel inevitable. Sometimes, when I look in a mirror while shaving, someone else is wearing my uniform. The face is mine, the body is mine, but the expression is all wrong. Too patient, too knowing, too hungry. The eyes reflect light like an animal's, and when I blink, the reflection blinks a fraction of a second later, as if it's struggling to keep up with the performance. I check the old maps again, spreading them across my kitchen table in the pre-dawn darkness when the whispers are strongest. Geological surveys from the 1960s, topographical maps from the Forest Service, even hand-drawn charts from the original Cherokee inhabitants. There's no cave behind Broken Falls. There never was. But that doesn't matter anymore, because the mother doesn't need a physical space to exist. She's in the stone, in the water, in the voices of everyone who's ever felt truly alone. She's in the spaces between what's real and what we desperately want to be real. And she's in me now. I can feel her moving under my skin sometimes, following the same pattern Sarah carved into her arm. Not painful exactly, but present, a reminder that I belong to her now, that I always have. When I'm helping lost hikers find their way back to the trailhead, I catch myself suggesting they visit the falls. When I'm filing missing person reports, I find myself recommending search areas that lead toward the water instead of away from it. Small things, subtle redirections, the kind of gentle guidance that feels helpful instead of malicious. But the mountain knows. It remembers every person who's disappeared into its depths, every soul that's joined the eternal chorus beneath the falls. And it's patient enough to wait for the right moment, the right words, the right lonely wanderer who's ready to trade their isolation for something that promises to love them forever. The radio crackles beside me as I finish this report. Another missing person, a young woman this time, last seen photographing wildflowers near the falls overlook. The dispatcher gives her description: blonde hair, blue eyes, hiking alone, seemed depressed according to the friend who reported her missing. Perfect. I reach for my gear, checking the batteries in my flashlight, testing the strength of my climbing rope. Standard equipment for a search and rescue operation. But I know I won't be rescuing anyone tonight. If you ever go to Broken Falls and hear your name whispered in the mist, if you see faces in the rock that seem to be reaching for you, if you feel an overwhelming urge to step behind a cascade and explore the shadows there, don't turn around. Don't speak back. And for the love of all that's still sane in this world, never step through the waterfall. Because once the mountain marks you, once the mother knows your voice and learns your loneliness, you never truly leave. You just wait for your turn to call the next one home. Come home. Come home. Come home. There's a sound I'll never forget. Not the howl of wolves cutting through winter air like broken glass. Not the crunch of boots on pine needles that sounds too much like bones snapping. Not even the scream of a lost hiker, that raw primal sound that turns your blood to ice and sends you running toward danger instead of away from it. It's the sound of an old rotary phone ringing. That mechanical, relentless bell that belonged to a time when everything was simpler, when communication meant something solid and real. When you could trust that the voice on the other end was actually there, breathing the same air you were, existing in the same world. It started one night at the ranger station, just after 1 a.m. The witching hour, my grandmother used to call it. When the veil between worlds grows thin and things that shouldn't be possible suddenly become inevitable. I was alone, sipping bad coffee that had been sitting in the pot since noon, reviewing trail cam footage that showed nothing but shadows dancing between trees and the occasional deer stepping delicately through moonlit clearings. All the landlines had been disconnected years ago, relics of a bureaucratic past that had no place in our digital present. Everything had gone to satellite phones and encrypted radios, devices that crackled with static and the reassuring chatter of other human beings. But the phone rang anyway. Rang. Rang. The sound cut through the silence like a blade, sharp and mechanical, impossibly clear in the thick quiet of the station. It echoed through the whole building, bouncing off wood-paneled walls and filing cabinets stuffed with incident reports, coming from the back storage closet where we kept the antique desk. Just for show, something to remind visitors of the old days when rangers logged everything by hand in leather-bound books, when every detail mattered because lives depended on careful record-keeping. I stared at the closet door like it might breathe, like it might expand and contract with some hidden pulse. My coffee grew cold in my hands. The footage kept playing on the monitor, but I wasn't watching anymore. Every shadow on the screen seemed to move with purpose now, every rustle of leaves carrying whispered secrets, We'd never wired it, never connected it to anything. The phone was just an old relic from a time when rangers logged everything by hand, when communication was a lifeline stretched across vast wilderness, when hearing another human voice meant the difference between survival and becoming another name carved into a memorial plaque. And yet it rang again. Rang, rang. The sound seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if whatever was calling knew I was listening, knew I was trapped between curiosity and terror. Against every instinct screaming in my chest, against 20 years of training that told me to radio for backup, to follow protocol, to never investigate alone, I walked to the door. My hand trembled as I turned the handle. The hinges groaned like they were in pain. Inside, sitting on the dusty desk like it had always belonged there, the black rotary phone gleamed in the dim light. I picked up the receiver. Static, like a storm trapped in wire and plastic. Then a voice, low, wet, like it was coming through a tunnel filled with water and blood, like it was drowning while it spoke. Do you know what you forgot? The words hit me like a physical blow. I slammed the phone down and locked the closet, turning the key with shaking fingers, listening to the metallic click echo through the building like a gunshot. Thought I was going crazy. That the isolation, the endless nights alone, the weight of being responsible for thousands of acres of wilderness had finally cracked something inside my head. Until it rang again the next night. And the next. And then other phones across the park started ringing. Phones in decommissioned lookout towers that had been abandoned for decades. Phones in collapsed cabins where the floors had rotted through and the walls had surrendered to time and weather. Phones with no power lines. No batteries. Phones that shouldn't have worked. Phones that had been declared dead and buried in paperwork filed away in dusty cabinets. But were calling me anyway. I didn't tell anyone at first. You don't stay long as a park ranger if you start sounding unstable. You start talking about ghost phones and whispering voices, and the higher-ups will write you off as overworked faster than you can pack your gear. They'll send you for a psych evaluation, recommend a nice desk job in the city where the only calls you'll get are from angry tourists complaining about parking fees. 23 years of service, commendations for search and rescue operations, medals for bravery. All of it forgotten the moment you mention something that doesn't fit neatly into their reports. But the ringing kept happening. The calls always came between 1 o'clock and 1:07 a.m. Never before. Never after. I tested it one night, sat beside the old desk with my watch ticking in silence, counting the seconds like a countdown to execution. The station felt different at that hour, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The familiar creaks and settling sounds of the old building seemed amplified, every gust of wind against the windows sounding like fingernails scratching at glass. At 1:03 a.m. sharp ring. Ring. The sound cut through my vigil like it was scheduled, like whatever was calling had its own twisted sense of punctuality. It didn't matter if I was in the main office, out on patrol driving the winding mountain roads with my headlights cutting through forest darkness, or even miles away at one of the service cabins tucked into remote valleys where cell signals died and the only company was the whisper of wind through ancient pines. The phone always found me. Somehow impossibly, there would always be a phone. Sometimes it was the original rotary in the closet. Sometimes it was a different model, older, newer, sitting on whatever surface was closest, a tree stump, a rock, the hood of my truck. They appeared like mushrooms after rain, sprouting from the landscape itself. And when I picked up, the voice on the other end was never the same. Sometimes it was a child sobbing deep, heartbroken wails that spoke of loss too great for young lungs to bear. The sound would echo through the receiver like it was coming from the bottom of a well, distant and hollow and desperate. Sometimes it was a woman screaming like she was falling down an endless shaft, her voice growing smaller and smaller until it became just another whisper in the static. But most nights, it was silence. Just static and breathing, and that same damn question delivered in a dozen different voices, young and old, male and female, all united by the same urgent need. Do you know what you forgot? The question haunted me during daylight hours. I find myself distracted during routine patrols, staring at trail markers and wondering what I might have missed, what detail had slipped through the cracks of my memory. I started keeping detailed logs of everything: wildlife sightings, weather patterns, maintenance issues, conversations with hikers. If I was forgetting something, I document everything until the forgotten thing revealed itself. I started losing sleep. Real sleep, not just the light dozing that comes with night shift work. I lie in my bunk staring at the closet door like it might open on its own, like something might step out and explain what I'd done wrong, what sin I'd committed that required this midnight penance. Dark circles formed under my eyes. My hands developed a tremor that made filling out paperwork an exercise in frustration. I unplugged the phone, even though there was no cord, even though logic dictated that unplugging something that was never plugged in was an exercise in futility. I removed the receiver, unscrewing it from its cradle and hiding it in my desk drawer. When that didn't work, I took the whole damn unit apart, piece by piece, scattering the components across my office like the bones of some mechanical skeleton. But the next night, there it was again, fully intact, back on the desk, sitting in perfect working order as if my desperate dismantling had been nothing more than a fevered dream. The receiver gleamed in the moonlight streaming through the closet's single window. Even the dust patterns were exactly the same. So I did the only thing I could think of. I drove to the old ranger station, the one shut down after the wildfire 10 years ago, when 3,000 acres went up in flames and took half the infrastructure with it. The building had been burned halfway to ash, its roof collapsed, its windows blown out by the heat. Nothing remained inside but rusted lockers and melted chairs, twisted metal that had been shaped by temperatures hot enough to melt steel. The Forest Service had declared it a total loss, too expensive to rebuild, too dangerous to salvage. But I had a hunch. The drive took 2 hours on roads that weren't really roads anymore, just tire tracks carved through underbrush that had reclaimed the path. My headlights caught the reflective eyes of animals watching from the tree line. Deer, maybe, or something else entirely. The burned station sat in a clearing that still bore the scars of that long-ago fire, charred stumps poking up from the earth like broken teeth. And sure enough, behind the soot-black desk that had somehow survived the conflagration sat a rotary phone. Pristine, untouched by flame or time. The black plastic gleamed like it had just been polished. I didn't touch it. I didn't have to. It rang the second I walked in, the sound echoing through the hollow shell of the building, bouncing off broken walls and creating a symphony of mechanical bells that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I was 60 miles from the main station with no power, no signal, standing in a building that hadn't seen electricity in a decade. The phone lines had been pulled after the fire, the poles knocked down and hauled away. There was no possible way for that phone to work. And yet the call still came. This time, a voice whispered something different, something that made my blood run cold. You left us behind. The words carried weight, accusation, grief. They spoke of abandonment, of promises broken, of people who had trusted me and been failed. I backed out of the building without touching anything, but I could hear the phone continuing to ring as I drove away, the sound following me down the mountain like a curse. That night, I drank more than I should have. Jack Daniels from a bottle I'd been saving for retirement, burning amber liquid that did nothing to wash away the taste of fear. I sat at my kitchen table with files spread around me like tarot cards, searching for patterns, for connections, for anything that might explain what was happening to me. And I started researching. The Park Service keeps meticulous records, even if they don't like to talk about the strange ones. Buried in filing cabinets and archived in basement storage were incident reports that never made it into official histories, complaints that were dismissed and forgotten, stories that didn't fit the narrative of safe, well-managed wilderness. Turns out, I'm not the first ranger to report the calls. In 1994, a guy named Whitaker filed a handwritten report complaining of phantom phone calls. His supervisor dismissed it as stress-related hallucinations, the kind of thing that happened to rangers who spent too much time alone in the woods. The report was terse, clinical, Employer reports auditory hallucinations consistent with isolation psychosis. Recommends psychological evaluation and possible reassignment. But Whitaker's own words, scrawled in careful handwriting across 3 pages of incident forms, told a different story. Phones ringing in empty buildings. Voices asking about things he couldn't remember. Dreams of people calling his name from distances too great to answer. Later that year, Whitaker went missing during a routine trail sweep. A simple assignment: check the markers on the north face of Lookout Hill. Make sure the path was clear for weekend hikers. He'd done it 100 times before. But this time, he never came back. They found his truck parked at the trailhead, keys still in the ignition, radio crackling with unanswered calls. The search teams followed his boot prints for 3 miles, clear impressions in soft earth that told the story of a man walking with purpose, not panic. The tracks led to the edge of a cliff with a trail curve around a rocky outcropping, a spot where one wrong step could send you tumbling down 100 feet of granite and pine. They never found his body, just his boot prints near Lookout Hill, leading to the edge of a cliff, and then nothing. As if he had simply stepped off the earth and into empty air. And beside the cliff, a smashed phone. No wires. No connection to anything. Just a rotary dial cracked in half, black plastic scattered across the rocks like the fragments of a broken promise. I copied Whitaker's report and locked it in my desk, adding it to a growing file of things that didn't make sense but couldn't be ignored. The pages felt heavier than they should have, weighted with implications I wasn't ready to face. That night, my phone rang again. I let it go this time, sitting at my desk with my hands folded, listening to the mechanical symphony echo through the building. 3 rings, as always. Then silence. But this time, the silence didn't last. It rang again, and again, and again. It rang for 10 minutes straight, each tone sharp and accusatory, until the sound seemed to burrow into my skull and take up residence there. I could feel it in my teeth, in my bones, vibrating through the floor and into my chair, until I picked up. "You finally remembered," the voice said. It wasn't static anymore. The wet, drowning quality was gone, replaced by something worse, clarity. The voice was smooth, Mel, calm, almost friendly, like a salesman calling to tell you about an exciting opportunity, like someone you might have known in another life. But underneath the pleasant tone was something else, something hungry and patient and infinitely cold. "Who is this?" I asked, though part of me already knew I wouldn't get a straight answer. These calls weren't about information. They were about something deeper, something that lived in the spaces between questions and answers. The line hissed, static building like a storm gathering strength. Through the white noise, I could hear other sounds, distant voices, what might have been footsteps, the rustle of something moving through underbrush. Like I was listening to a party happening in another dimension, close enough to hear but too far away to join. Then he said, "I've been watching the trail for you. Someone is walking it tonight." The words were delivered with a matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting the weather, but they hit me like ice water. There was knowledge in that voice, certainty about things I couldn't see, awareness of events happening in real time across miles of wilderness. Click. The line went dead, leaving me staring at the receiver like it might bite me. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was expectant, like the moment before thunder follows lightning. Something was building, some convergence of events that I was being pulled toward whether I wanted to go or not. I couldn't sleep. The voice had been too specific, too immediate. If someone was really out there, walking trails that should be empty at this hour, then they were in danger. It was my job to know about every person in the park after hours, to track the permits and camping reservations, to make sure no one was wandering alone through wilderness that could kill you in a dozen different ways. So I got in the truck and headed for Trail 6, an old path we hadn't opened to the public in years. The Forest Service had officially closed it after a series of accidents, but the real reason was simpler. It was dangerous. The trail wound through unstable terrain, past hidden drop-offs and areas where flash floods had carved new channels through what used to be solid ground. It was overgrown, treacherous, and technically off-limits to everyone except authorized personnel. But if someone was walking it tonight, they needed help. The moonlight that night was sharp silver. Everything felt sharper. My headlights cut through forest darkness like blades, illuminating twisted trees and undergrowth that seemed to lean toward the road as if trying to reclaim the narrow strip of asphalt. When I reached the trailhead, I killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the vast silence of the forest. My boots hit the path like thunder, every snap of twigs beneath me amplified in the hush. The trail was worse than I remembered. Roots had pushed up through the packed earth, creating ankle-breaking obstacles in the dark. Branches hung low, forcing me to duck and weave, my flashlight beam dancing wildly as I tried to maintain balance on the uneven ground. And then I saw them. Footprints, fresh impressions in the soft earth, clear enough to read like a story. But as I knelt down and examined them with my flashlight, my blood ran cold. They were too small for a hiker. The boot treads were wrong, too shallow, too narrow. And the spacing was erratic, sometimes close together like someone taking careful steps, sometimes spread wide like someone running or jumping. Bare feet, human feet, but small, delicate. The kind of prints a child might make, or a woman walking without shoes through terrain that would tear unprotected skin to ribbons. I followed them, my training warring with my instincts. Everything about this was wrong. The isolated location, the impossible phone call, the prints that shouldn't exist. But if someone was out here, injured or lost, I couldn't just walk away. 23 years of ranger training don't disappear because you're scared. Half a mile in, the woods went dead silent. Not the natural quiet of a forest at rest, but something deeper and more absolute. No wind moving through branches. No insects chirping in the underbrush. No small animals rustling through leaves. Even the pine smell seemed to vanish, replaced by something stale and metallic, like the air inside a sealed tomb. The footprints led me off the main trail, down a game path that hadn't seen human use in decades. Branches closed in around me, creating a tunnel of vegetation that blocked out the moonlight and made my flashlight beam seem small and inadequate. Then I saw the woman. She was crouched beneath a fallen log, curled up like a child hiding from punishment. Her hair was long, hanging past her shoulders in dark waves that were soaked with mud and dotted with leaves and pine needles. Her dress looked like it was from another era, lace collar, small buttons down the front, fabric that might have been white once but was now stained with dirt and something darker. The dress was torn at the edges, shredded as if she'd been running through brambles for hours. Her feet were bare, dirty, scratched from the rocky trail. She was whispering. I couldn't make out the words at first, just a constant stream of soft syllables that might have been a prayer or a conversation with someone I couldn't see. The sound was hypnotic, rhythmic, like chanting or singing without melody. I stepped closer, my flashlight beam revealing more details that made my skin crawl. Her hands were clasped in front of her chest, fingers interlocked like she was holding something precious. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if she was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Ma'am," I called softly, not wanting to startle her, but needing to make contact. "Are you hurt? Do you need help?" She looked up. Her eyes were black, not shadowed, not bloodshot from crying or injury, not dilated from drugs or shock. Black, entirely, like ink had been poured into empty sockets, like someone had carved away everything human and replaced it with darkness that seemed to move and shift in the flashlight beam. The whispering stopped. I stepped back instinctively, my hand reaching for the radio clipped to my belt. Emergency protocol kicked in, call for backup, establish communication, maintain visual contact with the subject until help arrived. Dead. No static. No ping. No reassuring crackle of dispatcher chatter. Just silence, as if the radio had never worked, as if it was just a plastic prop strapped to my uniform. Then she stood. The movement was fluid, too fast, like she was being pulled upright by invisible strings. Her head remained tilted at that impossible angle, her black eyes never leaving my face. The torn dress rustled in the still air, making sounds that fabric shouldn't make, wet sounds like something breathing. Her mouth opened too wide. The jaw dropped past any normal range of motion, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous, arranged in rows like a shark's. And from that impossible mouth came a sound that bypassed my ears and went straight to my nervous system. She screamed, not sound, but ringing. The exact sound of the phone. Mechanical, sharp, relentless. Ring, 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 ring. The sound hammered at my skull from the inside, making my vision blur and my equilibrium fail. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beams spinning wildly, illuminating trees and shadows that seemed to move with predatory intent. I ran. I didn't stop to think, didn't try to understand what I'd seen, didn't attempt to process the impossibility of a woman making the sound of a telephone. Pure animal panic took over, flooding my system with adrenaline and the single overwhelming need to get away from whatever that thing was. I didn't stop until my lungs burned and my legs gave out beneath me near the truck. I collapsed against the tailgate, gasping for air, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The forest around me had returned to normal. Wind in the trees, insects chirping, the distant call of an owl somewhere in the darkness. The next morning, I went back with a team. 2 other rangers, both men I'd worked with for years, both practical types who dealt in facts and evidence. I told them I'd seen someone in distress, that we needed to search Trail 6 for a missing person. I didn't mention the eyes, the scream, the way she'd moved like something wearing a human shape rather than something human. We searched for 4 hours, combing the area with methodical precision. We found the fallen log, the spot where I'd seen her crouched like a frightened animal. There were no footprints, no log, no woman, no evidence that anyone had been there except the 3 of us, our boots leaving fresh impressions in earth that showed no other disturbance. Just a rotary phone sitting neatly in the middle of the trail. Black plastic gleaming in the morning sunlight like it had been freshly polished. No scratches, no weather damage, no sign that it had spent even one night exposed to the elements. We bagged it according to protocol. Sent it off to headquarters for inspection, along with a report that carefully omitted any mention of impossible women with black eyes and mechanical screams. They said it was old. Disconnected. No threat detected. Standard bureaucratic language that meant they'd found nothing unusual, nothing that would require action or investigation. Just another piece of obsolete equipment that had somehow ended up where it didn't belong. I started sleeping in my truck with the engine running, the heater going, talk radio playing low to fill the silence with human voices that proved the world was still functioning normally somewhere beyond the boundaries of my increasingly unstable reality. But the calls didn't stop. They got louder. And now, sometimes I could hear other voices in the background. Whispers and murmurs and what sounded like conversations happening just out of range. Like I was listening to a party in the next room but couldn't quite make out the words. One night, my supervisor called me into his office. Tom Bradley had been a ranger for 30 years before moving into administration, and he still carried himself like someone who'd spent more time in the wilderness than behind a desk. His office was decorated with photographs of successful rescues, commendations from grateful families, and topographical maps marked with hiking trails and emergency access points. He was the kind of man who dealt in practical solutions to concrete problems. He said I needed to take a few days off. Said I looked tired, worn down, like someone who'd been carrying too much weight for too long. Said other rangers had heard me talking to myself over the radio, except I hadn't touched my radio during any of the incidents he described. Jim, he said, leaning back in his chair with a careful posture of someone delivering bad news, you've been with us for over 20 years. You're one of our best people. But lately, he gestured at a folder on his desk, thick with papers I couldn't read from my position across from him. There have been reports. Concerns. What kind of concerns? I asked, though part of me already knew. Unusual behavior. Responding to calls that weren't made. Requesting backup for situations that other rangers couldn't verify. He opened the folder and glanced at the top page. Last week, you called in a missing person report for Trail 6. When the search team arrived, they found no evidence of anyone being there. I saw. I'm not questioning what you think you saw, he interrupted gently. But I am concerned about your state of mind. The isolation, the night shifts, the responsibility, it takes a toll on everyone eventually. That's when I knew something was really wrong. Because I'd heard them too. Voices. On the static between regular transmissions. Humming beneath the routine chatter of rangers checking in, reporting status, coordinating patrols. Whispers that seemed to come from the radio itself rather than through any external signal. Line open. He's still listening. Tell him to come back. At first, I thought it was interference from other agencies, state police, Forest Service, maybe even civilian radio operators bleeding through on our frequency. But the voices were too clear, too personal, speaking directly to me with knowledge they shouldn't have possessed. So I left. Tom gave me 2 weeks paid leave with the understanding that I'd come back ready to work within normal parameters. No more phantom emergencies. No more reports that couldn't be substantiated. No more behavior that made my colleagues question my fitness for duty. I drove to the northern edge of the park, past the marked trails and designated camping areas, deep into wilderness that most visitors never saw. The roads here weren't really roads anymore, just fire access tracks that were barely maintained, designed for emergency vehicles that might need to reach remote areas during natural disasters. There was an old communications tower out there, long since decommissioned, a relic from the days when radio communication was the only link between ranger stations scattered across hundreds of miles of forest. The tower rose 70 feet into the sky, its metal framework rusted but still structurally sound, topped with antennas that no longer transmitted anything but silence. I had to hike the last few miles on foot. The path was overgrown, marked only by occasional blazes carved into tree trunks decades ago. My GPS lost signal half a mile in, leaving me to navigate by compass and memory, following contour lines on topographical maps that might have been accurate when they were printed but didn't account for decades of erosion, fallen trees, and changing water courses. And at the base of that tower, nestled among the concrete footings and equipment housings, was a small shack. The building was maybe 10 feet square, constructed from unpainted wood that had weathered to a uniform gray. No windows, just a single door that hung slightly askew on rusted hinges. It looked like the kind of temporary structure that gets built for a specific purpose and then forgotten when that purpose is no longer relevant. Inside, everything was covered in dust. Moss growing in corners where moisture had seeped through gaps in the walls. Debris from animals that had nested in the abandoned space, scattered twigs, bits of fur, the remains of meals consumed in darkness. But right there, on a broken table that tilted precariously on uneven legs, sat another phone. Rotary. Black. Familiar in every detail. It rang the second I stepped in, the sound impossibly loud in the confined space, echoing off the walls and ceiling like thunder in a canyon. I didn't answer. Instead, I followed the cord. Even though it wasn't supposed to be connected to anything, even though logic dictated that a phone in an abandoned shack couldn't possibly have service, the black wire snaked along the floor, through accumulated debris, out a hole in the wall that looked like it had been chewed by something with very large teeth. The cord disappeared into the earth. I dug, with my bare hands, scraping away layers of dirt and decomposing leaves, following the wire deeper into soil that was dark and rich and smelled of things long buried. My fingernails broke. My knuckles scraped against rocks and roots. But I kept digging, driven by a compulsion I couldn't name. 2 feet down, I hit metal. A junction box. Military surplus from the look of it. Heavy steel, painted olive drab, and stamped with serial numbers that had been partially obscured by rust. It was bolted shut with hardware that had seized decades ago, but I pried it open with a tire iron from my truck, metal screaming against metal until the lid finally gave way. Inside, dozens of wires, all converging at a central hub, all humming faintly with electrical current that shouldn't have existed. Red wires, black wires, white wires with colored stripes, all carefully organized and labeled with tags that had faded beyond readability. And something else. A photograph. Black and white, the kind of formal portrait that was common in the early part of the last century. A young woman in a high-collared dress, her hair pinned up in the fashion of the 1920s, her eyes bright with intelligence and humor. She was smiling at the camera with the confidence of someone who believed the future held nothing but promise. Of the woman from the woods. Younger, unmarked by whatever had happened to transform her into the thing I'd encountered on the trail. But unmistakably the same person, the same bone structure, the same delicate features that had been warped into something nightmarish. Dated 1927. Behind the photo was a name written in careful script. Margaret Delaney, park dispatcher. I researched her when I got back to my cabin, using my laptop and a satellite internet connection that worked when the weather was clear and the trees weren't blocking the signal. The Park Service kept genealogical records going back to its founding, detailed personnel files that documented the lives and careers of everyone who'd ever worn the uniform. Margaret Delaney had been hired in 1926 as the first female dispatcher for the Northern District, a groundbreaking appointment that had generated newspaper coverage and letters of complaint from men who didn't think women belonged in the wilderness. She'd been young, educated, fearless, exactly the kind of person the expanding Park Service needed as it tried to manage vast territories with limited resources. She'd worked alone in remote stations, maintaining radio contact with rangers scattered across hundreds of square miles, coordinating search and rescue operations, serving as the vital link between civilization and the wild places where people went missing and sometimes never came back. Turns out, Margaret went missing during a snowstorm in 1929. The official report was clinical, bureaucratic. Employee failed to report for scheduled shift. Search teams found no evidence of foul play or accident. Status: missing, presumed dead. But the details told a different story. They said she'd gotten lost after answering a distress call from an unknown number, a signal that came through the radio system but couldn't be traced to any authorized transmitter. She'd left her station in the middle of a blizzard, driving into conditions that would have been dangerous for an experienced mountaineer, let alone a young woman in a vehicle that wasn't designed for extreme weather. The last thing she told the ranger on duty at the main station, crackling through static and wind. He says he knows what I forgot. They never found her body, or her vehicle, or any trace of what had happened after she'd driven into the storm, following coordinates that led to nowhere. But I think I know what happened to Margaret Delaney. I think she's still out there. And she's not alone. Because every night since I'd found her photograph, the calls had started coming from two phones at once. Two distinct rings, overlapping and harmonizing like a duet performed by machines. Sometimes they rang in sequence, one after the other, like a conversation between partners who didn't need words to communicate. Sometimes they rang together, creating complex rhythms that seemed almost musical. Two voices when I answered, speaking in harmony. Do you remember now? One night, I stayed at the cabin near Blue Creek, a maintenance facility that was supposed to be temporary but had become permanent through bureaucratic inertia. It sat in a clearing surrounded by old-growth pine and the constant sound of running water. No power except what came from a small generator. No landline service. No cell signal for 20 miles in any direction. I left my phone off, left the radios behind, locked in the truck with the windows rolled up and the doors secured. Just me in the dark and the illusion that I could escape whatever was hunting me by cutting myself off from all forms of communication. The cabin was sparse. 2 rooms, a wood stove, bunks for Forest Service crews who sometimes stayed overnight during fire season. I built a fire, heated a can of beans, tried to read a paperback novel that I'd brought for distraction. But the words swam on the page, meaningless black marks that my brain couldn't process into coherent thoughts. And still, the phone rang. Not from inside the cabin. The sound was muffled, distant, coming from somewhere in the woods beyond the clearing. But unmistakable, that mechanical bell tone that had become the soundtrack to my deteriorating sanity. I grabbed a flashlight and followed the sound deeper into the forest, stumbling over fallen logs and hidden roots, my beam dancing wildly as I tried to track the source of the ringing. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off trees and rocks, creating false directions that led me in circles. The ringing became muffled, like it was coming from underground. I followed the sound to a small depression in the forest floor, a natural hollow where water collected during spring runoff. The earth here was soft, marshy, covered with a layer of decomposing leaves that squished under my boots. I dug with a stick, with my hands, with panic driving every motion. Dirt flew in all directions as I excavated frantically, following the sound deeper into earth that grew darker and more aromatic with each layer. The smell was organic, rich, but underneath it was something else, something chemical and preservative, like formaldehyde or embalming fluid. Until I found it. A rotary phone buried in the ground. Still ringing. The black plastic was pristine despite being submerged in wet earth, as if the soil itself was afraid to contaminate it. Mud should have filled the dial holes, moisture should have shorted out whatever impossible mechanism kept it functioning, but the phone looked like it had just been placed there moments before I arrived. And underneath it, revealed as I cleared away more dirt with increasingly frantic movements, was something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. A human jawbone. Yellowed with age, missing several teeth, but unmistakably human. The bone was clean, picked bare by decades of insects and small scavengers, but positioned with deliberate care directly beneath the phone, as if it was some kind of offering or foundation. I fell backward, scrambling away from the excavation, my flashlight beam wavering as my hand shook uncontrollably. The ringing stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. Then the phone rang from the cabin. I hadn't brought one. I'd checked every inch of the small building before settling in for the night, opening closets and looking under furniture, making sure I was truly isolated from any form of communication. I ran back through the trees, branches whipping at my face, roots trying to trip me with every step. The cabin's windows glowed with warm light from the fire I'd built, creating an illusion of safety and normalcy that I knew was false. Inside, sitting neatly on the rough wooden table where I'd eaten my dinner, was a black rotary phone. Its receiver was off the hook, lying beside the base unit like someone had just finished a conversation and was waiting for the next call to come through. And through the earpiece, a voice whispered with the intimate tone of someone sharing a secret. "They're remembering now." All of them. The words carried implications that my rational mind refused to process. How many were there? How long had they been waiting? What exactly were they remembering? And why did it require dragging me deeper into their impossible world? That night, it rained hard. Thunder cracked the sky like artillery fire, each boom rattling the cabin's windows and making the generator hiccup with electrical fluctuations. Lightning illuminated the clearing in stark, strobing moments that turned familiar shapes into threatening shadows. And from the window, through sheets of rain that distorted everything into liquid impressions, I saw figures moving in the trees. Not animals, with their natural grace and predictable patterns of movement. Not people, with their heavy footsteps and need for shelter from the storm. Things. Silhouetted against the lightning flashes, they moved with fluid coordination, like dancers performing a choreographed piece. They were draped in ranger uniforms that didn't match any decade I could identify. Some too old, from an era when the service was just being established, others too new, designs I'd never seen but that looked somehow futuristic. The figures wore smiles that I could see even at a distance, expressions too wide and too fixed to be natural. Their teeth gleamed white in the lightning, perfect rows that caught and reflected the electrical discharge like mirrors. And they were dragging phones behind them. Not carrying them, but pulling them along the ground on cords that slithered through the wet earth like snakes. Rotary phones, push-button phones, even some models I didn't recognize, all connected to the figures by cables that seemed to stretch infinitely into the darkness. I locked the door, though I knew it wouldn't matter. Closed the curtains, though the thin fabric provided no real barrier against whatever was circling the cabin. My hands shook as I fed more wood to the fire, trying to maintain some semblance of normal activity while my world crumbled around me. But when I turned around, the phone was gone. The table was empty except for my dirty plate and the paperback novel I'd abandoned. No phone, no cord, no evidence that anything had been there except the faint outline in the dust where it had sat. I left the cabin at dawn, loading my gear into the truck with movements that were mechanical, automatic, driven by muscle memory rather than conscious thought. The storm had passed, leaving the forest washed clean and sparkling with droplets that caught the early sunlight like tiny prisms. Called in sick when I reached an area with cell coverage, telling the dispatcher I needed more time, that I wasn't ready to come back yet. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, hollow and distant, like I was listening to someone else speak my words. I didn't return for 2 weeks. But when I did, when I finally walked back into the ranger station with a hope that time and distance might have broken whatever connection was dragging me into madness, I found that my desk had been moved. Not rearranged, moved. Shifted 3 feet to the left, repositioned so that it faced the window instead of the door, angled in a way that felt wrong, uncomfortable, like sitting in a chair that had been designed for someone with different proportions. And sitting on top of it, centered precisely where my computer monitor used to be, was a brand new rotary phone. The black plastic gleamed under the fluorescent lights, unmarked by dust or wear. It looked like it had just rolled off a production line that had been shut down 50 years ago, a perfect replica of technology that belonged in a museum rather than a working office. Beside the phone was a folded piece of paper, cream-colored stationery that felt expensive between my fingers. The message was written in careful script, the kind of penmanship they taught in schools before typewriters became common. For you. Line already active. Welcome to the network. Sign MD. Margaret Delaney. Still reaching out from whatever impossible place she'd been trapped in for nearly a century, still trying to make connections, to build bridges between the world of the living and whatever realm she now inhabited. That night, my phone rang at exactly 1:03 a.m. But this time, when I answered, the voice was different. Clear. More present. Thank you, Margaret said, her words carrying across decades of silence and separation. I've been so lonely. I've stopped trying to fight it. The phones are everywhere now. In places where phones have no business existing, sprouting from the landscape like some kind of technological fungus that feeds on isolation and desperation. In closets that have been sealed for years, ringing behind locked doors that no one has opened since the previous ranger retired or disappeared or simply stopped coming to work one day without explanation. In hollow trees, their black plastic gleaming through gaps in bark that has grown around them like scar tissue, as if the forest itself is trying to heal around these intrusions from another world. Even once, impossibly, in my car, I opened the glove compartment looking for registration papers and found a rotary phone nested among the owner's manuals and insurance cards, its dial glowing faintly in the dashboard light. I've tested them with a methodical precision of someone who still believes in rational explanations. They're not powered by any source I can identify. No batteries, no connection to electrical systems, no solar panels or hand cranks or any other mechanism that might explain their function. Not connected to any network, any infrastructure, any system that exists in the physical world. I've traced their cords to dead ends, to connections that lead nowhere, to junction boxes filled with wires that terminate in empty air. But every night they ring. Different tones now, a symphony of mechanical voices calling across impossible distances. Some ring with the sharp urgency of emergency calls, others with the patient rhythm of someone who has all the time in the world to wait for an answer. Different voices when I pick up, each one carrying its own story of loss and longing and things left unfinished. But always the same message, delivered with variations that speak to the depth of their collective need. You forgot us. But we remember you. I think the phones are markers now, understanding dawning with the slow certainty of someone who has finally accepted the impossible. Memorials to people who died alone in the wilderness, whose stories were never told, whose names were filed away in incident reports and forgotten by everyone except the forest itself. each one tied to someone who was lost in these woods, someone forgotten, their story condensed into a single ringing tone that echoes across decades. A hiker who died in 1982, caught in an unexpected blizzard, still whispering the name of his dog because that was the last thought in his freezing mind. A ranger from 1955, lost during a routine patrol, still humming a song his mother used to sing because it was the only thing that kept the darkness at bay. A child who wandered away from a family camping trip in 1967, still calling for parents who searched until their own deaths, never knowing their daughter had fallen into a ravine 20 feet from where they'd made camp. And sometimes, cutting through the chorus of individual voices, there's just sobbing. Deep, heartbroken weeping that speaks to loss so profound it has become its own form of existence. Like they're trapped on the other end of a line that was never meant to go dead, suspended in a network that connects not places but moments, not locations but emotions, not people but the echoes of people who refuse to let go. And now they're remembering. All of them. Coming back through lines of connection that were established long before electricity, before technology, before human beings understood that some forms of communication transcend the physical world. They're not calling for help anymore. The realization hits me with the force of absolute truth, reshaping everything I thought I understood about what was happening to me. They're calling for company, for acknowledgement, for someone to bear witness to their stories, to remember their names, to ensure that their existence mattered enough to be recorded by another living soul. So if you're ever in the woods, walking trails that feel older than they should, passing through clearings where the silence is too complete and the shadows fall in patterns that don't match the position of the sun, and you hear a phone ringing where no phone should be, that mechanical bell tone cutting through forest, quiet like a blade through silk, don't answer, unless you're ready to remember. Unless you're prepared to become part of a network that spans decades and connects the living to the lost, the found to the forgotten, the present to moments that refuse to become past. Because they're not calling for help. They're calling for you. To join them. To add your voice to their chorus. To become another point of connection in a system that grows stronger with each new member, each new story, each new soul willing to pick up the phone and say, I remember you. You mattered. Your story deserves to be told. The phone on my desk is ringing now as I write this. It's 1:03 a.m. And I think I'm ready to answer.